Dragons, Searanox the Feared, Act 2, Courting of Dragons, Part 1, Axemis. Azurea had a mouthful of watermelon, a rare and expensive treat stolen off a caravan. It was cold from being on ice in one of Searanox's deepest storerooms. She wasn't chewing, nor swallowing, just holding it there. Her mouth hurt so very, very much. Breathing lightning could do that to a dragoness who wasn't expecting it. Though she'd been the ripe age category of a young adult sky dragon before she'd done it for the first time. Therefore her mouth was still soft, and her body unused to such powerful magic. Living a far more active lifestyle had prepped her for a breath weapon, but that didn't make it hurt any less the first few times it was to be used. Searanox was across from her, splayed out on his belly. He unfolded his wings, black as night, then refolded them for comfort while staring at her disapprovingly. He pushed another melon at her from the crate, showing her how to break it open. His mouth was a neutral line, not quite a scowl. Laying there in the half-light of the hoard room, it was a very tense scene. Azurea took the melon, swallowing what she had and choosing the new chilled fruit to fill her mouth so she didn't have to speak. He eyed her, saying nothing. Looking down, the great red pressed the pads of his fingers to the massive gem in his breast. It glittered in the torchlight, sunken in a bit so it couldn't easily be dug out without ripping flesh. He found the fake shell of scales, putting the panel over his heart so he looked normal again. It had once camouflaged the void in his chest. Now it covered a gem the size of, well, a melon. He snorted hot steam in mild annoyance. He did not know how to react. It was a gem, yes, but he could still feel it pulsating upon him like a real heart. He felt heavy and weighted down by it. Searanox had had the blasted thing removed over 50 years ago, to spare him the pain of losing the one he loved. Now here it was again, forced upon him.
"You could have let me die,"
he said finally. Azurea carefully swallowed her mouthful of melon, knowing these first moments would be critical. No, I could not have.
"I was bleeding out. You could have had my mountain lair, my hoard, everything all to yourself,"
he said, brow furrowing. The pulsating in his chest was distracting. He's used to a void of nothing.
"Any red dragon with half a brain would have let me die and consolidated my riches for their own."
"I am not a red dragon, Searanox," she said gently, shaking her head. She reached, pushing bits of her mane behind her ear. She ran her eyes down the handsome, jagged bits of guard scales, the blades of his tail, and the crown of horns upon his head. Living weapon though he was, irritated, he seemed somewhat collected at the moment, despite everything that had happened. "Are you angry with me?" she asked softly.
"No, I don't know."
He said it like a question, for his brow was furrowed as his eyes didn't see what there was before him. He glared at the carpet of gold and gems beneath them, the massive hoard he'd stolen from the 5 houses of golden dragons he'd slaughtered. He looked conflicted.
"I feel odd,"
he said after some more silence. Azurea cocked her head a little, leaning, as though his body language might tell her more.
"How did you find it?"
"I stole the coin meant to summon the architect and questioned her. Then I stole the model castle from the game room and broke it open," she said, relating the events of earlier that day. "I heard your cries and rushed out with it. I found you bleeding out and killed the dragon slayer that was poised over your body. Then She trailed off, eyes falling to the fake scales on his chest.
"Lightning breath,
he said with a neutral face, eyeing her.
"I did not know you could do that."
His expression was somewhere between disapproval and annoyance. "I couldn't before. I'm strong enough now, I suppose. It just came to me like instinct," she said, dancing about the subject because she knew the harder question was coming.
Why did you do it?
The Great Red nailed it on the head. You are not a whole dragon, she said softly, neck arching in a swan-like fashion as she picked at the treasure they lay on. I know losing a loved one can hurt, but you are not dying. When she said it out loud it sounded so corny, but he said nothing. You mutilated yourself, and I wanted to see what you might be like if you became whole again. Your deathly injury from the lance just made it a
convenient time to show up with my heart and fuse it back in again,
he interrupted, eyes travelling her. He was angry to be alive. Was he angry to have his heart restored again? It was hard to tell. For the moment the anger was simmering beneath growling words. Azurea opened her mouth to defend herself, but the metallic sound of clanking armor began to work its way up the tunnel. Both of them turned.
Perhaps I should just set the woods permanently on fire to deter these interruptions,
he growled, drawing himself up onto his more formal draconic poising.
Searanox the Feared.
The man was rabbit folk, of course, for the region was full of little else. It struck both dragons, not for the first time, how silly it was to wear armor and yet have those massive ears sticking out of the helm, much less the cotton ball that stuck out of the backside. Both just begged to be ripped off and set on fire. Had the rabbit folk never gone to war with each other and not seen these massive flaws? Azurea snorted. Why do no dragon slayers ever come in here shouting my name, The blue dragoness complained, laying out on her belly while Searanox approached the trespasser. I've been here almost 2 months, and no one ever knows my name at all.
You'd have to slaughter a few villagers and such,
Searanox said nonchalantly over his shoulder. Just as he was speaking, the knight seized the opportunity and jabbed him in the chest with a long sword. The fake panel of his scales easily gave way to the gem beneath, and the blade shattered against it. The Great Red spread his black wings as the knight stared at his broken sword handle in horror.
Unless you have another blade on your person, little knight, I would say that you are already dead.
The audible click in his throat told of his inner kiln turning on, and black smoke rose from his nostrils. Azurea winced just a little at the knight's death rattle, watching him collapse into ash. The panel of fake scales fell away, broken by the initial unannounced strike. They're getting a little smarter, the blue dragoness observed. That one tried to kill you while you were looking away and talking. Searanox shrugged, unimpressed. The average sword could not pierce the guard scales of his chest anyway, but being struck over his heart only reminded him of the situation at hand. He sat on his haunches while a pile of armor before him smoldered.
What shall we do now?
Searanox said, tracing the pad of his finger over his heart a few times as though to see if it was scuffed by the knight's sword. Well, Azurea said, cocking her head a little, why don't we see just how you feel, then continue as we had been thus far? You may have your heart back, but you are still Searanox the Feared. She offered him a helpful smile, but she could see his grouchiness was already pulling a shell up around him. Searanox the Feared! Someone else outside the cave roared. Strange that this voice was strong enough to carry all the way down the tunnel so clearly.
Behemoth blast you all!
Searanox roared, his patience having finally snapped. His tail blade sprung open with the sound of drawing swords.
What? What? Who is it this time? What ungodly force drives you imbecilic creatures to antline into my lair?
He stomped angrily past Azurea, his tail spraying sparks back and forth across the rocky walls of the tunnel that led outside.
What? Who is...
The Great Red fell silent, and his brow rose at the new visitor. It was a sky dragon, one as big as he was. They stared out at each other, Searanox's midnight wings opening and his chest inflating to a more aggressive poise. The Great Red had never seen a cloud dragon of this size, and was understandably just a little bit intimidated. Not that he couldn't take him, he was Searanox the Feared after all. It would be only polite to hear him out first, then kill him if needed. The sky dragon's mane was disheveled and oddly cut, and 4 horns instead of 2 grew upon his back. They were eye to eye in height, and the massive horn on his muzzle would have easily trumped the spade-like shape of Searanox's face.
I've had a very, very bad day, and you have only a moment or 2 to explain your intrusion before you get a face full of fire,"
he hissed at the intruder, his jowls lifting into an angry grimace of many massive fangs. "My name is Axemis, of the West Cloud families," he said, seating himself oh so comfortably upon the ground that was littered with bones of Searanox's conquered enemies. "I believe you have my bride, Azurea of the Eastern Cloud families." The great red blanched at the serious expression on his face, eyeing him up and down. There was a long silence for both dragons, sizing each other up, quickly followed by Searanox blurting,
"Tiamat's tits, you must be twice her age."
His black wings folded as he laughed at the nest robber. He knew little about life cycle of cloud dragons, but they grew in a size far slower than reds did. Size announced age amongst blues, and this trespasser was time and a half bigger than Azurea was. Though the laughter drew colour to the newcomer's face, the massive sky dragon did seem astonished at the fluent swearing as well as the accusation. "Arranged matings are not about age. They are more about bloodline and power," he said, wings flaring out in warning. Searanox reflexively dug his claws into the ground to anchor himself, never to underestimate a breed that could create cyclones with relatively little effort. If Azurea's size and talents were any sort of indication, this dragon would be far more powerful, and certainly not to be lightly dealt with. Such posturing! Azurea slunk from the tunnel of the mountain lair like a gliding swan, flowing gracefully along the ground until she was shoulder to shoulder with Searanox. "Why don't you just pull them out and measure?" she chuckled as she seated herself, all too amused that this day had finally come. "I see it took you 2 full months to get off your pompous arse to come and find me, Axemis." She eyed him up and down with an amused twinkle. "Could you not summon the brain power to track down a fire dragon whose territory runs for 500 square miles? The lair is a mountain after all." The tuft of her tail ran, smooth as silk, over Searanox's chest. She was showing him off, like a great fighting dog. He knew, but he didn't much care. Despite her comments, Azurea had joined in the posturing. Axemis eyed her. She did not look like she had been described to him. He'd been expecting a sort of fresh young dragoness who had little in the ways of worldly strength or magic. No, this dragoness was slim, trim, and the undeniable hum of passive dragon fear hung in the air around her. There was no court-raised lazy grace to her. No, she was mostly muscle. "Our arranged mating was 2 months ago," Axemis said after a few stunned moments of staring at her. "Yet here you remain with this animal. Better to lie with dogs than to sit among snakes, Axemis." Azurea barked, rising to all fours again. She slowly slid away from Searanox as his black wings opened into a more threatening posture. The tone was easy enough to follow. Axemis was not welcome. Searanox, on the other hand, wears his heart on his very sleeve, and doesn't give a damn what others think. I can respect that. Her chuckle was venom-laced, though it tinkled like a bell. You, on the other hand,
"Have every right to snatch you away like the mail-order bride you are,"
Axemis growled, the formality melting away to reveal the ugliness very suddenly. Searanox's brow rose at the audacity, and that had snapped the final straw. The great red sprang upon him with a roar. The vorpal wind came immediately, as the great red expected. He folded his wings hard, turning from a kite-like structure to that of a ballista shot. Splitting the wind with his great weight, he landed upon Axemis so hard that the ash beneath them rushed away in a great ring. Wings flapping, claws slashing, shouting and roaring, They rolled and flailed over each other like wolverines. Azurea stalked around them like a waiting partner, melting from the clearing into the foliage of the woods for her moment to strike at Exemis. Searanox was truly not used to an opponent who was his size. Sky dragons this size simply did not ever occur to him. Even the guard sent after Azurea had been roughly her size. Their foreheads met as their crowns of horns cracked against each other over and over. Neither would concede their hard-headedness to the other, though Searanox had more horns. Axemis's muzzle, horn, and sheer greater skull weight had the advantage. Knocked back a bit, the great red used the momentum to turn his whole body and swing his bladed tail, catching him satisfyingly in the face. He revelled in Axemis's roar of pain. Blood spattered the ground, and he snarled, continuing their circling. Axemis reared up like an angry mountain goat, slamming his horned muzzle down upon Searanox, who took it in the chest and roared. The gem upon his chest glittered, scuffing the horn and sending a splinter of bone to the side. The great red followed the deflection with the slashing of black claws. The two of them danced. Axemis may have been better while flying, but while upon the ground they seemed evenly matched. The thought suddenly occurring to him, he spread his massive blue wings and began to labour off the ground.
No, you don't.
A loud clicking foretold fire, and a blast of heat seared the membrane off of one of Axemis's wings. He toppled to the ground, turning and using the weight of his tail to warn Searanox away. "My wing!" he roared, flightless and in agony. He clenched at the useless limb, fairly shrieking and hissing at his enemy. It was a nasty and underhanded blow to aim right for a dragon's wing. The membranes would take months to grow back. The nerve of this wild beast.
Animal though you may think me, Axemis, I am not so stupid as to let a sky dragon take wing in combat, especially one your size.
Searanox chuckled black smoke from his maw, molten eyes burning behind the thick veil. They rushed forward, biting and clawing and shrieking, twin titans of air and fire. They left craters into the veil, and toppled trees in their brawl. Turning with grand effort and just the right timing, Searanox brought his tail blades about. It clashed against the massive horn on Axemis's muzzle, chipping lightly and recoiling both of them. Tossed by the recoil, Searanox left grand claw lines in the ground as he skidded backwards. Axemis rolled away with his own great weight, toppling trees until he righted himself and started forward with just as much gusto. Pushing vines and foliage out of the way, he almost didn't notice that one of them wasn't a vine at all. A long, strong tail had wrapped its way around the blue dragon's neck from above. Azurea had finally made her move, catching the weight of a slowly falling tree. She gagged Axemis and rode the momentum of the tree itself, pulling him down. Flat upon his back he was helpless. Searanox instantly recognized the thrashing, oiled snake body language, for he'd seen Azurea do it when she'd been pinned down before. Leaping with all his massive weight, the great red pounced upon Axemis, viciously slashing back and forth at the guard scales. Any lesser dragon would have been crushed to death, but Axemis was truly large enough to withstand Searanox's attack. Azurea clung to the tree with all her claws, her noose tightening upon Axemis's neck. Finally they had him pinned, practically spread-eagled. "You cheated!" Axemis gagged. "I dueled for Azurea and—" Azurea accidentally tightened her tail.
You dueled for something that was not yours to have, as I understand it,
Searanox whispered, black smoke rising from his nostrils as his inner kiln clicked on.
Out here, beyond your silly courts and politics, the real dragons fight to the death.
His molten eyes flickered to Azurea.
By any means necessary.
There was silence between all three dragons, until the great red put the final word in. He leaned in close, even within the range of fangs, to say it like a lover's whisper.
She's more red than blue.
The powerful blue struggled, beyond rage any more, shouting obscenities like a hatchling that had been thoroughly shown up by a sibling. Azurea tightened her tail to silence him, grinning with venomous satisfaction.
"What shall we do with him, Azurea of the blue sky?"
Searanox asked her, black smoke rolling from his nostrils as he held the struggling blue with weight and claw. "The shame of defeat can be worse than death in the circles he travels," Azurea said, stroking Axemis's cheek nastily. "Let him go. His honor binds him to leave us, at least for now." Searanox looked surprised at her mercy, but liked her poisonous reasoning. He would suffer more alive in his backward draconic society than he would dead in a respectable one. Slowly they let him up and came shoulder to shoulder once more. "Get out," Azurea punctuated, sitting regally upon her haunches. Axemis held his mouth and horn, where he bled. The rising mounds on his scale patterns told of bruising, and no doubt his throat would be nearly closed soon from all the choking. He turned to flee noisily through the foliage. Searanox leered at the burnt wing, a lopsided and predatory smile.
"He'll be back, won't he?"
he asked Azurea. "No doubt. He still thinks of me like an object he can just take away. Like he owns me." Azurea snorted, panting a bit from the exhilaration of the fight. She'd practically hung the dragon who'd been her betrothed 2 months ago. It felt good. She felt alive in all this violence, more draconic. She looked over at Searanox. "More red than blue, she prodded, giggling lightly. He smirked, saying nothing. It had not taken long for him to pay compliments. If the heart was active, perhaps he would continue to improve, and she could prod the real Searanox out of his armored shell. Leaning, she gingerly ran the scuff of her mane under his chin, a gesture of friendly affection. Passing under his jaw, she whacked him with her tail tuft a little, and retreated into the mountain lair. He watched her go with a weary expression. Searanox sat on his haunches at the edge of a cliff. Arching his neck, he peered down at the village to the south once more. He'd been there all afternoon, and they'd been panicking and milling about screaming all afternoon. He was just looking. Sheesh. They didn't scream and panic when Azurea stared down at them for hours on end. Perhaps she thought of them like ants, something to be stared at as a novelty. She'd been living there for a few months now. Surely these creatures did something worth watching that he just hadn't seen yet. Whatever Azurea saw in them, he didn't see it, and that made him bored. He'd only tossed one fireball down upon the village. Just a little one. They looked bored and sleepy anyway that afternoon. Only one house had burned down. The Great Red shrugged, watching the little rabbit folk rush back and forth to stem the flames and hide their sheep and cows from him in barns that were well within sight. Searanox was thinking, contemplating really. Running the pads of his fingers over his glittering heart, he was thinking of Azurea. What was she to him now? Burden? Tenant? Savior? Now, what? Friend? Companion? He did not know. His chest was still heavy, and he was having trouble sleeping with the stupid heart still beating all the time, like hearts were prone to do. Turning his head to watch the passing clouds, he curled his tail about himself to study his tail blades for nicks. None. Even the horn of mighty Axemis had not left a single blemish upon it, though he could feel a mild bruising, and his chest did hurt. He didn't tell Azurea that, of course. Part of being invincible was covering up one's injuries, even after opponents of fairly equal strength challenged you. But he would not mention it, and Axemis would never learn that he'd actually caused the great red pain. Fidgeting a bit, he frowned and returned to his original thoughts. Azurea had lived in his mountain lair with him for perhaps 2 months. for protection and sanctuary from a lifestyle she did not want. She'd been prissy and crabby, and responded to all his barbed comments with barbs of her own. However, with his heart restored, there was a certain itching hotness in the back of his head. Was it guilt for harassing her on the day of her arrival? He cocked his head and thought. In all technicality, the deal they'd arranged on the first day had still not been completely negotiated. But she'd been there for so long now, both of them had all forgotten about it. She'd offered up herself, and even lifted her tail to go through with it. "Sex is about passion," he'd said, "and I am heartless." He'd not molested her, but he had allowed her a sanctuary nonetheless. Did he feel cheated for getting nothing out of their deal? He thought for a long time. No, not really. Azurea was nothing if not amusing on a daily basis, and made an interesting tenant. Perhaps she was a good stem from the boredom that often plagued him, and perhaps that was payment enough. He did not know. She did tend to draw interesting characters into his territory now and then, something that would have certainly not happened if she wasn't there. His thoughts were wandering, and the hot feeling on the back of his neck soon vanished as he pondered other subjects. Searanox wheeled his head about when he saw a pair of armored rabbit folk taking off out of the village to a local farmstead. His eyes followed them, but he was not out to cause any havoc today. The village's burned building belched black smoke while they rushed buckets and primitive water pumps to put out the fires. His heart was restored. It was true. He was very uncomfortable with the whole idea. But he would be dead if Azurea had not snooped and figured out everything. He could feel now anger and hunger and horde lust. What would a heart inspire? He could barely remember loving a story. His brow furrowed in deep thought while he sought to an itch under his wing. His thoughts drifted back to Azurea. She'd become, well, more feral since she'd arrived. Before, she'd barely seemed to know what to do when dead animals were dropped in front of her, much less how to fight to the death. Now she could breathe lightning, snatch farm animals, and was even gathering a small horde in her private chamber. The Great Red found himself attracted to her, and the annoying thumping in his chest revved up until it was in his ears. Courting Azurea? He suddenly wondered aloud, narrowing his eyes as he contemplated. He sorted through his memories of her. They'd certainly warmed into a sort of sordid friendship, but this prospect of having her and a more romantic companion was alien. She was his tenant, no, friend. He frowned more deeply. What was she to him? She seemed to like him well enough, especially while he was shredding knights, or showing her treasures. Was that not what dragons were? Great beasts of power that killed, hoarded, and lived like the glorious animals they were. She seemed to like all the best bits anyway. Searanox peered down at the village again. The fire was under control, and they were working on knocking the building down so they could build a new one. He thought of sending down another fireball just to keep the game going, but didn't. He had more important things to think about. Turning, the Great Red opened his black wings and took to the skies, heading north towards the lair. He turned skyward, flying way up high where it was very cold. He settled upon the mountain summit, curling his tail around it and digging his claws to anchor himself. He settled and looked out over the clouds. It was interesting to look down at them, even though the air was thinner up there. He huffed a little. Searanox the Feared was a loner by nature, but most red dragons were. Sky dragons like Azurea had societies, open courts, and extensive politics. They were completely different animals, yet she'd come seeking the wild, more purely draconic side of things. Did that not make her more red than blue on the inside? He fingered his heart a little, admiring the pun of his own fate. Idly blowing hot steam on the ice he stood upon, he uncovered a chest. Popping it open, he admired the architect coin. He'd hidden it from Azurea since she'd basically stolen his last one. Thumbing it a few times, tossing it up and down, he put it back and buried the chest. Heaving a great annoyed sigh over his troubled heart, he growled in frustration. Taking wing once more, Searanox glided down from the clouds into the mountain lair. Landing hard upon the ashy vale, he halted when he heard the tinkling music of a harp. Azurea was within, playing. Leaning about the tunnel as he entered, he spied her doing just that, sitting so regally upon her haunches, paws gliding where they pleased over the harp, a wordless song adrift in the air. She was beautiful. The Great Red wanted her, not just as a friend or tenant, or what have you. His heart restored, and a great time since the death of his last mate. He wanted a companion. He found. Growling in disapproval at the honesty his heart foretold, he emerged into the cavern. "Why so growly, O feared one?" Azurea quipped, eyes narrowed in a relaxed, amused expression. Her tail rolled a bit to flick the tuft at the end in his direction. Searanox fought down a shiver, advancing slowly across the room. Her paws leapt and dove with ease, precise motions to pluck the strings. The music soothed him, rubbed at his mind with easy emotions. Instead of answering, he made a great red semicircle around Azurea and the harp. She watched him with intense expression, as though he might pounce on her at any moment, but his body language did not tell such tales. "Tired from something?" she asked a little quieter, slowing the tempo to a more restful one. "Thinking," he admitted to her, tail blades stretching open and then closed before they fell upon the carpet of wealth that surrounded them. "Don't hurt yourself," she snorted, arching back a bit and leaning to see his face. When she saw he was not baited by her barbs, she wilted into a more serious expression. "What about?"
You and I.
Searanox said somberly. Azurea gave a little start, but the harp's music did not waver. The red dragon either could not or would not lie to her, which had been proven many times. "What about us?" she said carefully, avoiding his gaze.
I want you.
Her paws jerked to a halt and her tail tucked over her loins. "You know our rule. You have to catch me first." She started edging away, as though he would spring up and pounce upon her right then. Though the original terms of their deal had been called void, they still remained in the back of her head.
Not what I meant,
he said, frown growling and not moving further from where he lay curled about her. She stopped, trying to edge away, a confused frown on her face.
I just want you, he said, as though that were explanation enough.
She blinked at him for his vagueness. He shrugged, not willing to go into detail. Rising slowly, he uncoiled and started away slowly. Azurea's heart quivered a bit, for she didn't know if he meant what she thought he meant. It seemed too soon after his heart was restored to pursue anything directly. Searanox left her for the deeper portions of the mountain tunnels, and she got up on all fours. Slinking along slowly, she cocked her head and rested upon a pile of gems and gold. He seemed troubled. He was probably trying to overcome the sudden rush of emotions he was capable of again. The more likely explanation now that his heart had been replaced. He'd wanted her, then he didn't, and he left. It was confusing. He would need private time to sort it all out, she knew. Males needed their space sometimes. Azurea turned suddenly when she heard a loud creaking noise outside. Wheels, cart wheels. Frowning, she headed outside through the proper tunnel and poked her head out. She spotted a pair of armored rabbit folk riding away on horses with all speed. On a cart, strapped to a stake with a thick rope, was a young rabbit woman. The dragoness groaned. They'd asked for horses last time. And what had Searanox been doing all day that would merit another sacrifice? She didn't know, and was too annoyed to ask. Leaning, she nipped the ropes off with her teeth and listened for a while to the blubbering and weeping of the panicked creature. "Now then, if we're all cried out, I have a job for you."
A job?
The little creature's ears folded back in wariness, as Azurea leaned forward, grinning daggers at her with amused eyes. Act 2, Part 2. Beating Heart. Searanox moaned miserably, holding his aching head and stinging eyes. "Sleep," he commanded himself. "Sleep," he said, turning over and curling up doggishly. He hid his head under his wing, shrouding his head in darkness, but that did not help either. Sleep. The great red shivered with an aching of relentlessness, sweating and cold in an exhausted way. He'd been awake for almost 4 days straight now, and even his great endurance was starting to wither away and die. It was his heart, his beating, always beating heart. It thrummed during the day. It revved up when he hunted. It trilled when he rolled about in his hoard. It never stopped. He could feel it pulsing within him where the void once was. And it never halted. It kept him awake in the night, and could not find rest. Moaning again, he stuffed his head under a mound of gold, and moaned again. Azurea's head poked out of her sanctuary when a particularly long moan reverberated through the tunnels. She cocked her head. Ears perked until another one came, and she shuddered. "Is he having nightmares?" she wondered aloud, stretching and then slinking down the dark tunnel towards the hoard room. Approaching on all fours, she saw him squirm about, then another way, then back the way he was. Nope, not asleep. She stopped trying to be quiet and lumbered forward, frowning. "Searanox?" He twitched when she called his name, looking at her with a baggy-eyed expression. "Yee!" She startled back a little. "What happened to you? You look terrible!" she shrieked, coming forward and holding his face in her paws. He moaned a little incoherently, and she rubbed the underbags of his eyes. "You haven't been sleeping," she deduced by his shabby-looking demeanor. He'd been acting more and more irritable lately, so this was why.
"Break something on my head,"
he pleaded, grasping her shoulders.
"Just knock me out."
The delirium of sleeplessness was beginning to set in, his draconic dignity and regal mannerisms long gone. He pressed a chest of gems into her paws.
"Over my head. Do it," he commanded her.
She started to argue, but there was no way she was going to pass this up, and her concern was poisoned by rotten desire. Azurea lifted the chest, and he bowed his neck, eager to be put out of his misery. She smashed it down with all her might, spilling sparkling gems all over him like confetti. They sprinkled down with a tinkling sound, running off his crown of horns and muzzle. He shuddered at the impact, but wasn't harmed. It didn't work. Azurea frowned when he seemed unaffected. She marveled at him being able to withstand such a blow without flinching, despite his exhausted state. He moaned, wavering, but unable to find rest. "Do you want me to keep beating you?" she offered sweetly, unable to resist. He moaned at her, holding his chest and turning away from her.
"You miserable, crabby thing,"
he cursed her. She cocked her head, leaning over his quivering form with the swan-like neck poised overhead. Her mischievous smile fell. "It's your heart, isn't it?"
"It won't stop beating. I can't sleep,"
he complained, holding his eyes shut and rubbing his brows. It took much to fell Searanox the Feared. and no knight she'd seen had ever come close. She'd never seen him thus, but 4 days with no sleep had reduced him to a quivering, moaning ball of miserable red scales. Azurea caught herself wondering what would happen if some mounted warrior came in any time soon. Could she fend it off in this place? She didn't know. She'd gotten lucky with the last one. Frowning deeply, she considered her options. Azurea could poison him and administer the antidote while he slept. No, that could go horribly wrong. She could beat him into submission, but she was not strong enough to hurt him with blunt force trauma, much less knock him out as she tried. Perhaps some sleepy grass. No, none grew in this region for her to pick and pulp. His heart kept him awake, but she couldn't exactly help him remove it. What could she... The blue dragoness cocked her head, wings shuddering as Searanox moaned. Leaning forward, his neck was not covered with spikes like a male dragon's neck was. All the spines and horns were on his head, so many of which she often likened it to a crown, but his neck was smooth, especially right under his jaw and hood. Hold still, Searanox. She slunk over him as he hunched, wavering back and forth but unable to pass out from exhaustion. He paid her no heed, but didn't seem to be going anywhere. Gulping and hoping this didn't suddenly go horribly wrong, she lifted her tail as she stood in a semicircle near him. Her fur-tough tail whip-cracked and suddenly coiled around him like a snake. He gagged, eyes wide, and he started flailing weakly. This didn't work on Axemis. His neck was covered with thicker scales. She held on, flung about while he writhed in a panic and pain. Searanox, good night! There was a crackling sound like knuckles, and blood flow was cut off somewhere for a few moments. Searanox's eyes fell closed, and he fell like a rag doll. Azurea grunted when they hit the ground in a mess of limbs and wings. "He's so heavy!" she cried, writhing like an oily snake that had been caught by a hunter. "I cannot dead lift you, great red. Get off me, you oaf!" she snarled viciously, her victory short-lived. The blue dragoness writhed about under his massive limp weight, and froze when he growled. Leaning her long neck around to see his face, she found him to be sleep-growling, much like the first day they had met. Her expression softened, and she stared at him for a long time. Laying back on her back at last, she stared at the ceiling, quite stuck. His scent slowly came over her from such close contact, the salt of sweat, the spice of fire, and the aching scent of wooden earth. She dared not press her muzzle into his mane for a greater sample, but it wasn't a repulsive smell. Laying there for a long time, just breathing, she looked upon his body up close. Her hands came up to rake gently upon his armor-like scales. Azurea rarely got the chance to truly inspect him up close. She found herself cupping his face a moment, looking upon its handsome features. His heart troubled him beyond the new feelings he had found, it seemed. Turning, Azurea dug into the carpets of the gems and finery that carpeted the floor of the hoard room. Digging back and forth, she finally made a hollow spot and wiggled out from under him. Falling sideways and panting a moment, she stared at his motionless form. Cracking his neck much harder would have been no different than hanging him from a massive tree. Good thing she'd practiced the technique before on a much more powerful dragon than Searanox. She shuddered at the memory of Axemis, but shook her head quickly to banish it. The great red seemed to be unconscious and breathing. Close enough to sleep for her. Checking her wings for tears, she fiddled with her mane as she regarded his sleeping form. She would have to sleep in the hoard room to watch over him. Leaning and checking that he wasn't posed oddly in his slumber, she quietly curled up next to him. His body was warm, very warm. The cool metal of the golden coins piled around her feet nice, the gems kissing her underbelly. It was nice to lay on an honest Behamut hoard for once. Slowly relaxing and keeping her head pointed at the exit tunnel, she went to sleep. Searanox's mind was in such a haze of exhaustion that he saw red blots on the backs of his eyelids. They felt like 10-ton weights, and he didn't even care to lift them. Neither hunger nor nature's call was strong enough to stir him, so he drifted in and out of what he supposed was consciousness for who knew how long. He could have sworn he smelled a rabbit person near himself, but that would be just silly. No rabbit folk just wandered into the lair of Searanox the Feared. Well, none that weren't dressed in noisy armor to wake him. Surely his sleep growling would keep anyone away. He drifted off again, dead to the world.
Is he okay?
The tiny rabbit folk woman ventured timidly to Azurea, wrestling a large heavy barrel next to herself. She'd only just arrived, and had come with what her new mistress had demanded of her. "He's sleeping deeply," Azurea said limply, shrugging a bit. "Did you get the colours I asked for?" She leaned and sniffed at the barrel over the clay oil and colorant paint that she'd requested. Her virgin sacrifice had become a sort of pet.
Oh, yes.
The rabbit woman quickly turned and wrestled the barrel open, revealing it full of yellow paint. Sealing it tight again, she pushed hard to bring it next to the other two, red and blue paint respectively.
It took a few days to make as much as you asked for, but they were happy with the extra payment you provided.
The woman was still obviously very scared of the blue dragoness, but the sleeping grey red wore on her mind, for she kept checking over her shoulder to stare at him. "Very good, my pet Aurelia," Azurea smiled, grasping the barrels in her paws and moving them to the tunnel that led to a sanctuary room. "I will not eat you. Return in a fortnight for further orders," she commanded, pushing a fat satchel of gold into her arms. The young woman went pale. All that money, more than she'd ever seen before.
Go on,
Azurea snarled to punctuate, and the girl ran. The blue dragoness snorted a bit, checking on Searanox once more. He slept on, though his stomach stirred. He would be starving when he awoke, for he had been out for more than 20 hours. The blue dragoness leaned over him, inspecting his face closely. No scars, no real markings of any kind. It was a chiseled and well-sculpted face, neither tarnished by time nor injury. Her paws moved to their own volition, stroking both sides of his face a few times. She played with his mane, his ears, and lifted his jowls to see his teeth up close. He was a handsome thing, her very quietest inner voice admitted. Running her thumbs over his cheeks a few times, she released him and let him rest. Within his own mind, Searanox felt a soothing presence. He could not identify it at first. It held him, coddled him, smoothed his mane with gentle paws. He liked this presence and tried to lean into it. But he was so tired still. He couldn't move, so he merely lay limp and enjoyed the attention quietly, sighing inwardly. When at last Searanox rose, it was slow and lethargic. There was a strange little rectangle shape propped up against the wall nearest to him. Shaking doggishly, and letting its eyes slide into focus, he found a painting of himself sleeping. He blinked, frowning at it. Whomever this artist was had certainly captured him in a positive light, for the colours and curves of his body were much smoother and brighter than in real life. The brush had been broad, but it had been easy to see it was him. For the heart on the painted dragon's breast was detailed to look like a gem, splayed out just so. It was a complex pose of restfulness. Was all he managed to get out before Azurea came in, looking quite proud of herself.
Did you paint this?
He asked. Mm-hmm. I almost snapped your neck, too. She flicked her forked tongue at him, teasingly. She got a few good guffaw out of his shocked expression at his statement. Well, you asked for it. She related all that had happened, and he pawed at his heart a little. Does it still bother you? She asked, coming closer.
Not as much, no,
he admitted. There was a long silence as they stared at each other, followed by the great red complaining.
Where is my chest panel? I am hungry.
It took a few hours for Azurea to remember that, in the past, she'd nearly put Searanox to sleep with the magical harp she'd pulled out of the music room, Very carefully she avoided it for the rest of the day so that the great red would not make the connection. A few days went by, and Searanox continued having sleeping problems. They puzzled over how to still his beating heart enough to let him sleep. While he pondered, Azurea flicked her tail just enough to stir the strings of the harp.
"That's it,"
he said, a curved claw pointing.
"You will have to put me to sleep using the harp," he told her. "Will you do that for me, Azurea?"
"It sounds so dark, putting you to sleep," she quoted him with a wry look. "But fine, yes, if it'll keep the peace in the cave enough for both of us to use and stay healthy." She looked upon him. He did look a little faded and frazzled. The past week had been very hard on the great red. While he lacked sleep and fought his own inner battles with his heart, he was frayed, and it showed. His temper swung back and forth seemingly at random, and he was especially brutal with the food lately. Though it was of note that his libido had vanished. Since his heart had rejoined his body, he had not even passed a dirty joke her way. Was it upsetting her? Azurea cocked her head at the thought. She didn't enjoy his blatant harassment, but she'd grown used to it as a part of him. The way he snarled and passed hot steam over her ears, it just...
"What are you thinking of?"
Searanox tore her from her thoughts, and she looked up.
"Your face is red."
Nothing. Let's visit the river," she quickly said. "I'm in a mood for fish and cool water." The summer was still hot, and while August wore on, it was still humid and sticky everywhere. Searanox nodded thoughtfully. Though he was a creature born of fire, he was not invulnerable to drought and lack of water.
"Very well."
He made for the entrance.
"It's been some time. I'm sure it's filled up with water again since your lightning breath destroyed it."
He flicked an amused glance over his shoulder at her as he went. Azurea's cheeks filled with heat, but he said nothing more. They emerged out into the ashy yard, and then took wing. It took perhaps an hour to find the perfect spot. Being so large, they both needed a wide and deep place to visit. They panicked a few sheepherds, shrieked at a group of travellers, the usual draconic things. Finally, Searanox pointed to a heavy lagoon that was at the bottom of the sheer cliff. They landed, and he splashed straight into the cooling waters, scaring away every fish within a mile-wide radius. Azurea sighed, but shook her head and smiled. She landed hard, not expecting the water to be as shallow as it was. She bowed her neck like the Loch Ness monster, paddling along and drifting through the light current. Searanox was too big to mimic her, and instead lay on his belly with his head stretched upward for air. "This is nice. It's cool." Azurea paddled along, dipping her head and frothing the water a bit. The summer was especially humid this year, and it was taking its toll on the land surrounding denizens. Even dragons sought things to stay cool. She stopped a moment when she saw Searanox watching her rather closely. "What?" she asked. He said, cocking his head and looking to one side. She sidled along the gravel and mud riverbed, drifting slowly through the crystalline waters. He nosed her with the broad of his muzzle, and she drifted to one side. "What?" she said insistently, batting him a little with her claws. He blunted their sharpness with the protective plate scales on his face, and nosed her again. Was he being playful? It was hard to tell. Taking the chance, Azurea lifted her tail and splashed him. He sat there, blinking as his mane wilted around his eyes. He shook his head doggishly, and a wry smile rose onto his lips. Closing the blades of his tail, he turned in the water and used the closed shape like a cup. "Ah!" Azurea shrieked, feeling like a hatchling. She dove at him, and they wrestled back and forth in the river. In a mess of wings and nervous laughter, they splashed back and forth, tackling one another. The crashing sound of the waterfall hid them, but it would have been a spectacle for any onlooker. Azurea caught Searanox chuckling. It was a deep, syrupy sound that would make even a nun blush. Caught up against the sheer cliff and behind the waterfall, The blue dragoness watched him move about. Searanox dipped his head, flanked by a crown of horns, into the waterfall to look at her.
"Hello,"
he said coyly, snorting hot steam and water out of his nose. Azurea palmed the whole muzzle and shoved him out, giggling. She leapt through the waterfall, spraying them both with water, and landed on him. Grasping his shoulders instead of his chest, she used his own weight against him and toppled the great red with a shriek of laughter. They sank, pinning each other and turning about in the deep waters. Searanox ruddered himself with his wings, and he flung themselves upon the sandbar. Azurea lay on her back, panting, giggling a little. Something light-hearted. This is what she needed, what they needed. Everything had been so serious and magical lately. What was better than playing in the water like hatchlings in summer? Azurea frowned when the sun was blotted out by Searanox leaning over her with a curious expression on his face. "What is it, Searanox?" she asked softly, looking up at him. He seemed unsure of what to say, his paw wandering and then palming at her chest a few times. Her guard scales clicked under his claws, while the other paw dug at the sandbar to steady himself. He leaned down over her, rudely and audibly taking in her scent. She flushed.
"Searanox the Feared!"
A brave knight, something or some other, emerged from the foliage. Searanox's powerful tail downed a tree with his blades, crushing him to death. He hadn't even looked up, so small was the threat that the little rabbit folk knight had posed.
"I want you, Azurea,"
He said the cryptic sentence once again, almost nose to nose with her. She eyed him with a curious, half-fearful look. He almost looked like he was going to... He leaned down to kiss her. Azurea squirmed a little. Dragons did not kiss. Dragons did not kiss. There was so much that could go wrong during a dragon's kiss. Claws, teeth, scales, wings. So much could get in the way to ruin the moment. Even the mortal races had no idea that dragons also followed the tradition. Azurea's tufted tail beat at his chest a few times, but he'd pinned her. Dragons did not kiss on the lips. No. That would be silly, and their mouths really weren't shaped properly. To the passer-by, it looked more like biting. Searanox's face travelled down to the tender part of Azurea, where her neck met her shoulder. Hot breath rushed over it, and he lightly sank his fangs into her. The dragoness yipped softly, squirming under him with her mouth silently agape. She whimpered a little, trying to ignore the ignited nerves and the amazing feeling of it. He adjusted and bit her again. She panted aloud just once. Both of her paws rushed up to rake at his heart and thick chest scales. The deep growling purr that rolled out of his chest made her shiver. She panted again. Then he released her, nosing at her neck. "I've caught you," he whispered, poking her with a slow claw. "Turn over." His massive fangs dug into her neck, and she gave a little shrieking, feral sound. Azurea obeyed, slow and flushed, while folding her wings. Grasping her tail, he lifted it up over her back. Searanox's scent fled over her as he moved within, hot and distinct, the salt of sweat, the spice of fire, and the aching scent of wood and earth. There on the sandbar, they were one. It felt right. Searanox growled a little when someone kept nosing him again. He had been sleeping. His heart thudded in his chest, and he growled and moaned, stirring. One of his molten eyes slitted open, scanning. Azurea was standing over him, sheepishly smiling. "The sun is setting, Searanox. We must return." She tossed her head a little, back toward the mountain. He rose lazily, unsure of what to say at this point. They were so close together. Leaning down and bowing his neck, he lightly touched his cheek with hers, in a brief, affectionate gesture. Then his black wings flipped open, and he took to the skies. Azurea looked at the lagoon they'd basically ruined with their wrestling and mating, scratching at her mane. Then she took wing as well. When they arrived back, the great red crashed into a mound of coin and gems in the hoard room. Laying out on his side, he knew it would not be long before sleep claimed him, if not for his beating heart. Unfortunately, the thrill of the flight had completely pulled him from the realm of sleep. Azurea slunk by gracefully on all fours, her tail tuft passing over his nose. He caught the brief scent of rain-pregnant clouds. Seating herself regally at the harp, she tuned it gingerly. Searanox growl-purred, closing his eyes to listen. He heaved a great sigh as the notes began to drift over him. She was so talented with that instrument, he thought. It was too bad she could not play for others besides himself, or perhaps earn money that way. Then again, dragons didn't exactly have jobs. Where was his mind? Azurea had something to give, though. Her song upon the harp. The great red pondered. Had his heart neutered his former way of life, along with his female's presence? Probably. Did he care, or plan to stop it? No, not really. He sighed, a little depressed at the raw honesty his heart gave to him, thudding in his chest, mischievous thing. He growled a little as Azurea's words began. Deep into the earth we go when sunlight's gone away. For our past, for our dead, we kneel to out and pray. While our lives go on in stride, we know those left behind will watch our wings and shine our scales as claws to foe do grind. You've been through many days alone. It's hard, I know it's true. Come forth, my little soldier boy. I'll sing a song for you. Act 2, Part 3. Gift. Searanox hacked as another spray of dust came off and rolled up a carpet onto his face. He was deep within the recesses of the mountain, in a room that he rarely visited. It was covered with massive shelving, and held a series of 50 or so dragon-sized tomes. Larger than what the mortal races used as doors, they were easily heavy enough to break the bones of lesser creatures. The Great Red referred to it all as the knowledge room. At least he would have if he had ever gone down there often. He tossed up tapestries, carpets, and lots of other junk into this room that was too nice to throw away, but not nice enough to display with his hoard. Pushing aside a few more crates of junk, he ported the shelving, checking over his shoulder. Azurea had gone out, cow-snatching, no doubt. That left him alone in the lair for a few hours, and he had some checking up to do. Finally he found it. Breathing hot steam over it to clear the dust, he laid it out on the floor, a scarlet book covered in rubies the size of chicken eggs, the Draconomicon, or the Book of Dragons. Red edition, of course. His parentage had given him his copy when he'd reached adulthood, for it contained all the laws and protocols that red dragons followed. There weren't many that were strictly followed, so it was a book of guidelines. But among the few things that Reds valued was always speaking the truth, and protocol on finding and wooing a companion. Some days after the incident at the lagoon, he'd finally made up his mind. Wanting a mate was a natural thing that all healthy dragons should want. It was no blow to his reputation, his honor, or anything of the sort to want a female. After some hours of sitting on a cliffside staring down over his domain, he admitted to himself that he wanted Azurea. He had no idea how to attain her favor, but surely the Draconomicon would have something to say about what red dragons did, and what they should do to draw the eye of a companion. He'd long forgotten how his story and he had ended up together. That rose had been nipped before blooming. Perhaps the old ways would give him more to work with when it came to Azurea. Shining one of the rubies on the thick cover with the pad of his paw, he nosed it open and gingerly flipped the pages. Draconic books were not paper. That would be silly, especially for creatures born of fire and the like. The pages were of thick, thick leather, which was one reason they were so big and thick. It didn't keep the writing from being tiny, though. The great red spoke a greater command word, and the torches around the room flared brighter. Leaning down and squinting, he ran a claw gingerly through the lines of law and sculpture, mumbling. Using his crown of horns to scratch at his shoulder, he mumbled as he scanned through it. Red dragons attract mates with great feats of power, wealth, and devotion. Not easily swayed into matehood, female reds are known only to mate with the strongest, the wealthiest, or the most powerful red males, while love is a major factor. The aforementioned 3 items must be satisfied first. The male must prove he is worthy and be able to support any hatchlings that may result from said mating. Searanox wrinkled his nose distastefully. Hatchlings? He had no thought of ever reproducing, with Azurea or otherwise. He barely had the attention span to watch over his own territory, much less a tiny life form that would require his constant care and aid. The beginning part made sense at least. I have power, wealth, and devotion? The last bit puzzled him. How could he demonstrate these 3 things to woo Azurea? He stopped a moment, comparing himself with his own past and future. Now that his heart had been restored, he was sure he was working hard to secure a new mate for himself. It seemed such a high priority, where hoarding and burning the countryside seemed at the wayside for the moment. Huh, he said after some silence, shrugging a little and leaning over the tome again. Great feats of power, wealth, and devotion, he mumbled, cocking his head in thought. Perhaps I could destroy that entire village of rabbit folk in one breath of fire. That would be impressive. He estimated the size of the village and the span of the mightiest breaths of fire. Calculating with a furrowed brow, it certainly seemed doable. The village down the mountain was a trading town, not much in the way of actual size. Wealth, well, I have that, he snorted. It would not be unheard of to share one's hoard with one's companion. That seemed perfectly fine to him. With a toss of his head, he scratched again, thinking over the final one. Devotion, he mumbled. That one puzzled him. How did one perform a great feat of devotion? He did not know, and growled in frustration. But 2 out of 3 wasn't bad. Closing the massive tome and replacing it on the shelf, he sat on his haunches, deep in thought. Thrumbing his talons a few times, he turned about and made his way to the hoard room. He grinned, nostrils sprouting black smoke. His first task was not only clear, but easy. The road to winning Azurea of the blue sky was sliding a little into focus, and the first bit was a trial by fire. Azurea was turning corkscrews in a particularly deep part of a mighty river, some distance away from the village of the rabbit folk. Now and then she would poke her head up to breathe, but then dive down again. She did enjoy swimming. It was relaxing, and cooled her down during those hotter summer noon times. Flopping her tail a bit to splash back into the water, she stopped a bit when she actually hit something, and several voices were flung squealing into the water. The blue dragoness righted herself, swerving her head back and forth with a frown. 3 rabbit folk children popped out of the water, puffing like walruses, amidst the wreckage of what had been a raft before.
Azurea, you wrecked a raft.
One of them complained at her. She growled at their disrespect, but then looked closer. It was the same 3 children she'd met before, the ones that had given her the title of the blue sky.
Now we'll have to spend the whole week making a new one,
The second complained. Azurea coiled her tail, sending them floundering to the sandbar while the debris of their raft floated away. "I was swimming here, tiny ones," Azurea said, cocking her head. Dragons didn't really apologize to the mortal races for anything they did, but she did feel a little bad for plunging them into the water so suddenly. "I did not see you."
"What else can we do today then?"
the third child asked the other two, wringing the water out of his massive ears.
"The river is out, and we've already went fishing this morning."
Azurea shook her head as they argued back and forth about what to do with their afternoon, as though there weren't a massive blue dragon looming over them that could create cyclones and breathe lightning. Innocent or touched in the head, they didn't seem to comprehend the fear they should be experiencing. She didn't mind the children, but there was a certain line of respect that dragons rightly deserved from the mortal races. Snarling a little, she felt a certain warmth wash over her body that tingled and nipped at her. Suddenly, all three children's eyes went wide and they turned to look at her. A slight breeze hummed away from Azurea like an invisible outlining force. Their knees knocked together, and they suddenly clung to one another, terrified. She looked back and forth between their faces. "Dragon fear," she mumbled, for it was the first time she displayed such power. Searanox did it now and then, mostly on smaller opponents he could frighten away. Grr?" It came out like a question, and the three children bolted, fleeing for their lives. The warm, tingling feeling flowed off her like spring rain, lingering the air like a mist after summer storms strike a hot road. "Well then," she tilted her head, taking a few deep breaths to try and make the feeling pass. It remained like a mild itch that made her scratch at her arms a few times. Then finally it vanished. Lowering her jowls to hide her teeth, Azurea inspected herself. First breathing lightning, now dragon fear. Was Searanox rubbing off on her? Was she hitting the next stage of the magic in her life cycle? It was hard to say, with no other sky dragons around, thank Bearmut, to instruct her on this. Well, she'd have to figure it out on her own. It wasn't as though she was hitting puberty, no. But more that latent skills were now awakening. In the Sky Dragon courts there was no use for dragon fear, so it was never discussed or explored, not to mention breath weapons like lightning or fire. Living a more feral and free life was melting away the prim and proper Azurea, revealing the glorious animal beneath, and she liked that. Wandering over to a nearby tree, she scratched the bark right off it. Cocking her head, she carved a mean-looking frowny face onto it. "Grr," she said to it, chuckling a little, backing up a bit and making doubly sure that no one was watching. She dug her claws in. She roared at the tree, trying to make it tingle with dragon fear. It did not. She took a deeper breath. She tried again. No feeling. Frowning, she went over what had happened earlier. She was upset at the lack of respect, angry. She needed more than a tree, it seemed. Frowning, she furrowed her brow and closed her eyes. Who was the greatest disrespecter in her life? One who deserved to experience fear. In her mind's eye, the face of Axemis appeared, over the face of the tree. The tingling returned. On the edge of her mind, she touched it with her thoughts. The tingling little fuzzy feeling. Tugging at it gently, she growled at the image, lifted her jowls. Grass bent away from her. The trees shuddered and leaves and twigs blew away in a perfect circle. Dragon fear. It tingled her body like her limbs had fallen asleep. It was good. It felt very good. Azurea shook like a dog, enjoying the raw and powerful feeling that it gave her. She would have respect. She would have fear from those who would not bow before her draconic might. She would... Searanox flew overhead, wings locked in a silent gliding motion. His shadow had passed over her, blotting out the sun. He was far too high in the air to have heard her. That high he was even skirting clouds. But where was he going? She frowned, placing all the regional landmarks in her mind. Cocking her head, her eyes suddenly widened in shock. The village! Taking wing after him, she swerved and stayed low over the tree line. Searanox dove like a hunting falcon, locking his wings as he swooped over the valley with a great shrieking cry. Dragon fear concussed the air like thunder. Thunder with no sound. Birds shrieked, knocked out of the air. Others flew off in a panic for miles. The town itself tore into a panic frenzy until suddenly the fire rained from the heavens. Searanox the Feared was upon them. Azurea shrieked in shock. He was going to level the entire village in one cataclysmic breath of fire. Unlike normal fire, Red Dragon's fire was almost liquid, for it clung to things and burned until nothing was left. The wave of molten death was free-falling from the sky in a giant orange blob of draconic magic. Searanox followed shortly after it, watching with great glee. The blue dragoness spiraled off to one side, diving into the river like a missile. Coiling all of her magics, she spread her wings under the water and started a very difficult spiral. Exploding from the watery depths with a line of water following her, she corkscrewed through the air at breakneck speed. Lengthening her body and closing her wings, she watched as time seemed to slow. A massive cyclone of water shadowed the town as a molten ball of fiery death came upon it. The twin forces collided, with concussive force of an exploding volcano. Searanox roared in panic, pulling up with his wings but crashing into the watery cyclone far before he could reorient. Swept up in the depths he roared, dragon fear exploding the watery tomb away from his body. A black, hissing rock of what was once molten fire crashed into the forest. Searanox was buried into the tree line, carried by the forceful spiraling motion until he carved a great swath in the hillside. Azurea of the blue sky arched hard over the village, her wings almost ripping the top off a steeple as she tried to keep from crashing. Wavering back and forth as she fought the violent winds, she righted herself and dispelled her magics. The villagers burst into cheering as the blue dragoness passed over the valley's edge. Searanox righted himself, shaking his head with a growling grunt. Flopping around to untangle all his limbs from the debris, he looked around quickly, expecting assault. Someone had not only stopped his massive fireball, but blasted him clear into the hills.
"What in Behemoth's name do you think you were doing?"
Azurea landed hard, practically spraining her own ankles in her anger. She rushed forward, thrusting her face into his with a shrieking growl of fangs. Searanox cocked his head and had to rear up a bit, like a mountain goat that was getting ready to repel another goat's headbutt. Dragon fear. She was oozing with dragon fear. His black wings opened, liquid midnight to blot out the sun. Thunder without sound as Searanox's dragon fear tsunamied over Azurea's. They cancelled each other out, and finally he could breathe properly, for his lungs and heart had been quivering when she landed.
"I was about to smite a town in your name," he told her,
throwing his chest out as impressively as he could. Surely this was a great feat of power to woo Azurea.
"Smite a village? You're a damned idiot."
She turned and the tuft of her tail snapped smartly over his cheek. His head cocked sharply to one side from the hit, a shocked expression on his face.
"Do you not remember? Do you not remember what I said about that place? If there's no town, no trade caravans come through here, nothing to grab for the horde."
She turned and swathed his face again, which he took with some dignity, for he knew she was right.
Would you be happier if I left the rabbit people alone? He offered, forked tongue lapping at the edge of his cheek to check for blood. Yes, yes, Searanox, leave them alone, she roared, leaning and trying to headbutt him. When this had no effect, she instead pressed her horns and head into his chest, which made him back up a bit. Promise me you will leave them alone. She headbutted him uselessly a few more times. Searanox the Feared cast his eyes over the arc of the valley, to the town below. They'd been coated with hot steam since a cyclone of water had collided with a great ball of fire just above their homes, but the village was intact. The Great Red frowned at the prospect of the entire town being immune to his own whims. Power, wealth, and devotion. Did willpower count? It had power in the word. Self-restraint had never been one of Searanox's virtues, but Azurea was certainly worth more than one town to him. He'd been willing to destroy it in her name, he thought. Surely he could leave it be in her name too. That made sense. Willpower is still power. All right, Azurea, he said in his deep, syrupy voice. She looked up at him with a rather startled expression. Putting on his very best bedroom eyes, he smiled his swords at her. I promise I will leave the Rabbit Folk town alone. For you. Azurea was blown away by the weight of it. Red dragons, Searanox often told her, were bound by their word. Truth and honor was everything to them. A promise was a huge thing. Just like that? She asked in a softer voice, not sure if she believed him. He nodded, folding his wings down for comfort. Okay, she said at last, looking over her shoulder to see the view. Good. Good. She said it twice, mostly to reassure herself. The sky dragoness slunk away into the underbrush, heading off again to her own activities. See you later, Searanox, she said over her shoulder. Searanox sat on his haunches, alone, gazing down at the village. He harumphed a little, but soon chalked it up to one of his own victories. Power, wealth, devotion. Checking one off his list, he grinned his honest, lopsided grin. This was not so hard. Searanox once more pored over the Draconomicon, reading bits here and there. The display of power for Azurea had not gone completely to plan, but had turned out all right in the end. If he wanted to make sure and look good to woo her, the next item would have to be something particularly impressive. Red dragons, according to the massive tome, were supposed to display great feats of power, wealth, and devotion to seduce and obtain a mate. Wealth, he mumbled, tilting his head. He thought briefly of sweeping great mounds of gold and gems into her private sanctuary as a gift. That seemed perfectly doable. She often complained that her room was bare, but still did not opt to sleep with him in his hoard room. Azurea liked her privacy. Nodding to himself, he left the sub-cavern and headed to the main treasury, poring over his mound of gold versus the stack of gems. He deliberated for a long time. If he gave something less than desirable, she would balk at him and grow angry. If he gave something too amazing, she would think him buttering her up. Deciding upon a trio of chests filled with gold, and a barrel or two of semi-rare gems, he nodded to himself. Using his tail to roll the barrels along, he held the large chests in his arms, going down the proper tunnel towards Azurea's sanctuary. He cursed loudly when a chest slipped free right around the corner from her room. Losing his temper, he smashed the other two upon the ground, spilling their contents everywhere, while the barrels were content to keep rolling down the tunnel and away from him. Red-hot angry, he pitched his tail over the mound of gold, sending coins every which way. Just then Azurea rounded the corner. She stared at him, and he froze in place. She said awkwardly. Redecorating, are we?
He looked at the mess he'd made, and a familiar hot itch made itself known on the back of his head. Seeing his open tail blades and flustered expression, she quickly amended. "Just keep your things out of my room. I don't want anything from your hoard mixing with mine." She slid past him in the tunnel on her way out. Searanox was crushed. What best way to show wealth if not to, well, share wealth? Was gold and gems not a good idea? What could one do in the subject of wealth to show one was great and worthy? Perhaps a gift, something obtained with said wealth that would symbolize his want for her. That's it. A symbol, not just a pile. He nodded, smiling his genuine lopsided grin of swords. I shall buy her a gift. It would need to be something expensive and beautiful, and worthy of, well, of Azurea. His face twinged with heat, and he scratched a few times. He really was getting into this courting thing. He frowned at himself, but then shrugged a bit, folding the membranes of his wings for comfort. He climbed out to the lower recesses of the mountain's tunnels. Some time later he headed outside. He'd forgotten all about the golden mess he'd made in the tunnel, and goodness knows where the barrels of gems ended up. Azurea was lazily sunning herself in the ashy veil, something she'd taken to after having seen him try it. It wasn't too hot for her guard scales, so she would not overheat. Searanox caught himself looking at the curve of her tail, then shook his head vigorously to get back to the task at hand. While she napped, he took off silently, flying skyward. He headed to the summit of his mountain home. Pawing through the snow and ice as he looked down upon the clouds, he drew out a large golden coin. Well, it was golden on one side, obsidian black on the other. Carved onto it was the image of a scarab with a jeweled back. Thinking hard, he sat there for a long time. What could possibly be impressive and worth Azurea's adoration? He thought over everything he knew of her, turning the coin over and over. She came from an aristocratic society she hated. She had a healthy hoard lust, and she was oddly protective of the rabbit folk in the nearby village. She liked meat as well as any other dragon, swam a lot, and could rev a dragon's heart at a glance in the night. Frowning at the powerful thrumping sound in his chest, Searanox growled a little and flipped the coin.
Tecton.
His draconic voice was like a rolling burst of thunder, sending little streams of loose snow down the mountainside. The coin rang like a tiny bell, bursting into a shower of golden sparks. The air before Searanox ripped open, revealing a circular golden portal. He squinted into its brilliance, ever defiant. Stepping slowly, he worked his way forward until he could fold his wings down and duck his head. He stepped through. A golden world of metal and magic awaited Searanox on the other side, grunting against the pressure of the magical presence. He found the architect sitting upon a throne at the base of a stair-step layered temple of some kind.
Why,
Searanox?
You have your heart back, I see.
She, if it could be called a she, sounded amused.
I see Azurea has been busy.
Searanox nodded a little, coming close and sitting regally upon his haunches. Out of respect for a power greater than himself, he arched his long neck forward into a sort of bow. Things have... He paused for the proper word. Changed. Azurea and I... It was so awkward to explain it aloud, when it came right down to it. She makes me hungry, he blurted at last. I am ready to pursue a new mate. My time of being heartless is over. A genuine twitch of startled amusement shuddered the architect's armored frame for a split moment. Then her stalwart grace returned, as though a shield had been thrown up. I see, she said slowly.
And you would only come here speaking of her if you had planned on me crafting something grand for her.
The demigod-like being surmised, and the great red nodded once. She leaned back in her throne, a sort of gurgling, thoughtful sound emerging from somewhere in her lower abdomen and out through her faceplate. She glittered, resting her chin out on her fist in a slightly more casual manner.
You're not going to ask me tips on women, are you, Searanox?
She prodded. His embarrassed glare drew a very haunting sort of laughter from the architect. Many voices, but mostly female. Searanox longed, not for the first time, to rip that helm right off the architect's head and toss it, just to make her chase it. But no, it was not wise to try to torment a creature so powerful.
I want to buy her a gift. No, make her a gift,
he amended a little more confidently. The architect sat silently, upright again as a deal was about to be struck.
I want the components to make a magical item, as well as detailed instructions on how to make it,
Searanox said. She stared at him, still silent. He would have to be more specific than that, they both knew. What did Azurea really like? He thought feverishly for a few moments, then suddenly it struck him.
I want her to be able to visit the rabbit folk in the town south of my lair, he said, nodding as a plan came together.
Well, I can certainly recommend a good turtle wax. She could shine her scales and make a good presentation while the villagers run away screaming,
the architect said bemusedly, both hands on the rests of her throne.
Without the rabbit folk knowing that she is a dragon,
Searanox punctuated. The architect's green eyes flickered with inner light.
That's more like it, I would think. And your payment?
She said, slowly standing. The ground nearby began to morph and shape into the desired items. First a sphere, then a box, then a long cylinder for Searanox to carry. Do-it-yourself gifts were not common for a demigod to be creating, but gold moved her hands, so who was she to disagree?
In my lair,
Searanox described,
outside the hoard room there are 2 barrels of semi-precious gems, and 3 chests of gold. The gold has been spilled all over the place in the tunnel.
The architect listened, her aura of magic tensing over the great red so hard he had to tense himself to stay upright.
Is that enough?
He made his offer. The architect raised her hand, just a bit. A portal ripped open right next to them, displaying the tunnel Searanox had been speaking of. As if by a powerful magnet, the coins and other bits of gold were drawn into the portal and poured out on their side. It made a sizable pile of coins, trinkets, jewelry, and other odds and ends.
This is acceptable.
I do not want the gems, the architect said, gesturing to the cylinder of supplies she had conjured from nothing.
It is yours.
Searanox went eagerly to the new object, feeling it for seams and smiling, putting its weight onto his mighty shoulder. He arched his long neck low again.
Thank you, architect.
Go and impress your female, Searanox.
The architect was already returning to her throne, leaving the pile of gold where it was and then sitting out of the clank of her armor.
I will be here if you have more business to conduct.
She watched the dragon turn, leaning hard to compensate for the materials in the cylinder she'd given him. As he vanished through the portal and it shut with a snap of rolling thunder, one of her hands clenched the hand-rest of her seat. The metal of the throne groaned as her fingers left impressions. Azurea woke with a start. Had that been thunder? Her head swerved about, scanning the skies. No storm clouds. Frowning wearily because Searanox was not around, she prayed it was not another snatching party of cloud dragons come to steal her. Didn't they get the hint that she just didn't want to be married off to some nobility dragon like Exemis? She choked him into submission once. That should have been enough.
"Milady?"
A tiny voice asked. "What?" Azurea rounded, caught in her angry thinking. Oh, it's you, Aurelia." The rabbit woman quivered with a level of fear that pleased the blue dragoness.
I've returned. It has been a fortnight like you asked."
It came out like a question, and Azurea laid out on her belly to see the mortal woman a bit closer. She meeped, her knees knocking together. "Good," Azurea hummed softly, flapping her wings just once to stretch them out. "The paints you brought last time were excellent. I am pleased," she said regally, bowing her neck like a swan as the wind tousled her mane. Aurelia nodded, looking relieved. "I have another task for you." "Yes, my pet." The blue dragoness turned and reached under her wing where she'd been keeping something. She produced a canvas, a picture of Searanox the Feared, sleeping on a hoarded mound of gold. "See if you can't sell this at your trading post of a town. I want you to haggle hard, and come back with the money it makes." The rabbit woman took the huge painting gently, looking it over. Whoever had painted it certainly cast the great red in a more favourable light, for he looked so peaceful when he slept. The emphasis on his chest and guard scales were interesting. They were shiny and almost gem-like. "Aurelia!" Azurea snapped the rabbit woman out of her admiration, causing her to jump. "Return when you have sold this painting for me, and I will give you a small portion of whatever it makes."
Yes, milady.
She bowed deeply at the waist, turning to flee with the art. "And Aurelia," Azurea sang melodically, "remember, if you keep any part of the gold for yourself, I will know. Dragons can sniff out liars and cheats." The blue dragoness gave a feral, draconic smile like 100 sharpened daggers. The rabbit woman gulped, nodded obediently, and ran for it with the canvas in tow. Azurea grinned, chuckling and turning around onto her back to worship the sun for a bit longer. When she did, a black shadow cast itself over her. "Hi!" "Ah!" Azurea flung herself upright and tripped headlong over a knight's armored skeleton in her brief panic. Searanox had appeared next to her, a great container over his shoulder. "What are you doing? What is that?" she demanded to cover up that he really had caught her off guard. "It's a gift," he said jubilantly, throwing out his chest at her. She recognized the gesture from when he tried to impress her before attempting to destroy the rabbit folk village. She eyed the container, vaguely log-shaped, wondering what was inside. "I still have to put it together, but I'll get it right to you." He leaned and nosed her onto her back with his spade-like muzzle, then turned on his talons and strutted into the cave. Azurea lay there on her side, very confused. He was building something for her? What? Why? Searanox prepared an empty cavern room, tossing everything out of it into the mundane items room. He used his tail to brush the floor relatively clean. He posted torches in the corners and all over the ceiling. He brought wood for a fire and dug a little fire pit, retrieving tongs and a dragon-sized hammer. Dragons did build things, you know, just not often. Of course they had tools. They just didn't have them laying around like some mortals that dragons could name. Breathing fire upon the head of the hammer to heat it up, he set a great weight against the door, slitted it for air, and set to work. It had occurred to Searanox that gifts meant more if they were built by the giver. At least to the mortal races they did. Why not for dragons too? He'd gone to see the architect with something in mind, and now he would put it together himself. Taking credit for its assembly would only add its value in Azurea's eyes. He was sure of it. Cracking open the massive capsule, he watched a number of assorted things spill out onto the floor. There were jars, bottles, scrolls, raw metal bars, magic dusts and marking chalks, plenty of olive oil and tons of other things. Reaching and trying not to feel overwhelmed, Searanox put them all in a line along the wall from biggest to smallest, turning the labels towards himself so he could read them. Taking up the leather scroll, he unrolled it. There was a long silence as he scanned it with narrowed eyes. He turned it sideways, grunting in frustration. He turned it again. Ah, there it is. Taking a deep breath, he grabbed his glowing hot hammer and a raw strip of metal. "Searanox the Feared, you come out of there!" It had been 3 solid days and the great red had not emerged from his workshop, not even to eat. He would not starve in such a small time, but Azurea was starting to get worried. There was always banging, crashing, hissing, drilling, cracking sounds coming out from that place he'd sealed himself inside, and it was driving her mad. She banged on the massive weight he'd put over the archway with her tail. It was true, a blue dragon's tail could be whip-like, enough to cause a sonic boom and draw blood like a real whip. But it just didn't carry the raw power that a red tail or a green tail did. Pushing her shoulder against the slitter barrier, she grunted long and loud, and slumped against it, panting. Eye to eye with the air holes that led into the room, she suddenly leaned eagerly. She could see shapes inside. It was red and orange, probably firelight, and that was wavering back and forth. Searanox's handsome draconic form was bashing away at something like a smithy at an anvil. Sparks kept spraying, but in different colors, orange, blue, red, then blue again. He was working with magics. Closing her eyes and taking deep breaths, Azurea began to slowly extend her awareness forward. Detecting magical things was not so hard when one practiced the craft. "What are you doing in there?" she mumbled distantly, the quivering cobwebs of her mind reaching into the room and wrapping gently around everything within. Suddenly, her mind was telekinetically punched in the head, and she recoiled with a shriek. Reeling and grabbing the tunnel wall with her claws to steady herself, she blinked white spots out of her eyes. She panted a little, holding the side of her head. She knew that sort of pressing, blinding magic any day. The architect. Searanox had fetched something from the architect and was putting it together himself. Didn't her items usually come assembled and ready? Azurea puzzled for a moment, but did admit that she was a little touched at the thought of him getting her a gift, not only from the architect, but one he was putting together himself. It was sweet, really. The blue dragoness found herself backing away from the ringing, banging, crashing sounds of the private room. Her expression softened and she cocked her head. She would let him alone for now, perhaps go hunting. When he emerged, she would be waiting. Act 2, Part 4. Village. Searanox emerged from his enclosure around the middle of the 5th day of being locked inside. Azurea had just slunk into the hoard room from her afternoon hunting when she heard the sound of shifting stone. Perching on a mound of golden gems, she perked up and waited. The great red emerged with a folded bundle of thick leather under his arms, and blinked a bit when he caught her staring at him intently. "Ah, Azurea." He smiled some, his lopsided grin of swords. "I'm all done." He gestured to his bundle. She slid close to him as he settled on the carpet of golden coins to rest. Azurea sat on her haunches, very close and eager to see what he had been working on so hard for so long. "What is it?" she asked, when she could stand it no longer. "Armbands." He unrolled the bundle to show her 2 massive, dragon-sized armbands. They were golden and covered with very complicated runes. They shone in the light of the torches that dotted the hoard room, sparkling mysteriously. Azurea deflated. "Armbands?" she asked, poking one with her claws until it slid over the other. "They're more than that," Searanox said defensively at her tone, nipping at the air in annoyance. Picking one up, he undid the clasp and held it out for her to try on. "Here, put it on." He smiled in a mischievous way as she slowly moved to hold her forepaw out to him. Leaning, he closed the armband around her upper arm and clicked the clasp into place. It adjusted visibly by magic until it was just the right size. He smiled and stepped back, letting her admire it. Azurea looked at it for a long time, blinking a little. Sure, it was golden and very pretty, covered with all those complex runes. But what of it? "What does it do?" she found herself asking in a flat tone, not sure if she was impressed with his gift.
Cuniculus!
Searanox rapped on the band of her arm with his claw, twice, barking a command word. Azurea gasped, her head tilting back as exhilaration flooded her body with golden magic. She twisted about as blue smoke clouded into the air. Shrieking fairly in confusion, she staggered about blindly. Searanox disappeared behind the smoke screen. She lashed about, flapping her wings were gone.
What have you done to me?
She cried, suddenly clutching at her throat. Her voice sounded ridiculous, and suddenly her tail flew up into her spine. Its balancing weight gone, falling to all fours, she writhed and moaned as the mane shortened, then burst with length. Then it was over. The blue smoke began to dissipate. Searanox flapped his wings twice to part the air as Azurea coughed and stumbled onto all fours. He leaned expectantly, blinking. In Azurea's place was a white and brown mottled rabbit-folk woman. He fought and fought a wry smile.
You look edible,
Searanox chuckled, fishing about in his hoard's riches until he found a jewel-encrusted hand mirror. He brought it to her and pushed it under her nose. Azurea gazed at herself, shocked.
I'm a rabbit folk?
She said, touching her throat again, for the voice was a tiny one.
I'm so small.
She turned around 3 times to see her plushy little tail, then clutched at her now massive ears. She ran her hands over the breasts, shapely hips, and clutched at the pads of her hands.
What have you done to me?
She shrieked in horror, staring down at the little pink-padded paws.
You like the rabbit folk in the village near here,
Searanox said, settling in a semicircle around her. She tried to get up and walk, but the body was too alien and she could not. Instead, she crawled around on all fours. The feet were just massive. How could they stand them?
I thought perhaps with this disguise you could walk among them. See them up close without their panicking before Azurea of the blue sky.
The great red breathed steam upon her face, whipping her now long hair back behind her shoulders.
So you turned me into one?
She demanded, beating at the front spade of his muzzle with her tiny fists. She bruised her hands a bit and stopped, whimpering and sticking the side of one paw in her mouth.
It's the band,
Searanox said gently, reaching out with a wicked curved claw. Azurea stayed very still as he wrapped the metal band on her arm, twice.
Cuniculus.
Blue smoke once again enveloped Azurea, and he backed up. Soon a blue dragoness emerged from the glittering smoke, coughing a bit and waving her massive paws. She felt herself over, looking amazed. Transmutation bands, my Azurea, the great red told her, smiling.
I went to the architect for the supplies and made them myself.
Them? Azurea looked over at the other armband, feeling the head rush of her body having been changed so rapidly. Why the spare? She leaned and nosed at the extra rune-covered circle of gold. Searanox's expression wilted in such a way that she quickly stammered out, "Oh, for you, right, yes," she said, chuckling a little nervously. You want to come with me?"
Well, if and when you decide to go,
Searanox said, a little miffed.
Anyway, there you are,
he said in a final sort of way.
They are for you to do with as you please.
Thank you. She poured at the golden band, studying the spider web of complicated magical runes. This will certainly be interesting. Perhaps I will get Aurelia to show me around her village, sample what they call food, and Azurea's creative mind was already generating ideas to what could be done and what could be gained by interacting with the rabbit folk. Not as a dragon, but as one of them. Sure, she'd be a stranger, but it was a trading post. They were used to strangers. Cuniculus! She wrapped the band twice, poofing down into a tiny rabbit woman again.
Cuniculus.
She grew to a dragoness again, each time veiled in thick blue smoke. She liked it, she decided, smiling faintly.
Who is Aurelia?
Searanox said mildly, reaching over and getting the second golden band for himself. In truth, the recipe had only been designed to make one band, but he'd been very careful and had stretched the materials to make two. No problem at all. He wasn't going to send Azurea into a village of strange mortals without some form of protection. They had a deal, after all, way back in the beginning. "My pet," Azurea said evasively. She suddenly remembered that Searanox had never actually met Aurelia, and might have been upset if he knew that the rabbit woman was going back and forth through their lair, doing errands for her.
"Mistress."
As though by some terrible Behemoth-given cue, the tiny rabbit woman emerged into the hoard room, blinking around.
Oh my!
Searanox grinned suddenly, slinking forth with the armband around his great forearm.
Is this her?
He said, picking her up by the back of her dress. Aurelia squealed impressively, flailing about in his palm as he turned it right side up. "You put her down, Searanox," Azurea said testily, coming close with an aggressive body language. He studied her for a moment, cocking his head, then set the rabbit woman down on her feet. She quivered nicely, so he considered it respect enough to let her not get snapped up without a second thought. "Aurelia," Azurea said in greeting, "it has been only 4 days. Have you already sold my painting?" The blue dragoness frowned when she pulled only a folded cloth out of her bag. "What is this? Surely my art is worth A platinum coin fell out of the folded cloth, and Aurelia held it boldly up to her mistress. A platinum coin was worth 100 gold coins.
Well, well, Searanox marveled. That's easily 3 months' wages for an average farmer. Who slings that kind of coin in your little town? For a painting.
He did not denounce Azurea's artistic skill, but rather the oddity of the nice fat price.
I don't know his name, my lord."
Aurelia cowered a little, but dropped the coin into Azurea's waiting paw when she held it out. The blue dragoness squinted at the coin, the stamped symbols, and sniffed the metal. It was real, sure enough, but also familiar for some reason. It was not a rabbit folk coin.
He just wandered up, looked it over for a while, and then bought it from me. Out of all the wares and things that I usually have."
The mottled rabbit scratched herself nervously, leaning her weight from one foot to the other like she had to pee.
"Perhaps a travelling buyer? I did not see him during any of the other market days so far this month,"
she said. Searanox clicked his tongue a little, then looked over at Azurea.
If you'd like to exchange those in my hoard for 100 gold coins, you can. Gives you more to lay on in your sanctuary.
The blue dragoness shook her head. "No, I earned this. I'll keep the coin." She turned it over, and then her eyes widened. The coin was stamped with a dragon's head. "Tiamat's tits," she swore blandly, leaning to show Searanox. "Dragon's coin," she told him. "Western Sky Dragon's coin."
"Dragons have their own money?"
Aurelia wondered aloud, as though this were a new idea. Certainly dragons just stole and hoarded other people's gold. What use did they have for their own money system? It was beyond her. Fire-breather growled and Aurelia cowered. "It looks like you sold my painting to someone from my homeland. Perhaps in disguise," Azurea said.
"Disguise?
Aurelia thought herself in big trouble.
How does a dragon disguise itself to walk among the rabbit folk?"
Azurea leaned with a hooked claw, tapping her golden armband twice. "Cuniculus!" She was consumed by blue smoke, shrinking down and emerged as a rabbit woman, splotched with brown spots. Aurelia blanched.
"Like this,"
Azurea said. She turned to Searanox, frowning seriously.
"If there are sky dragons hidden in the village of the rabbit folk, we must go and sniff them out."
I agree.
Searanox was growling, scowling from under his eyebrows. Folding his wings, he reared up, tap-tapping his golden armband with a claw.
Cuniculus,
he snapped. Red, swirling smoke poured forth from nowhere around his ankles, wrapping him in its inky embrace. He closed his eyes, feeling his wings force themselves into his back. His crown of horns melded into his massive twin ears. He growled and snarled, writhing about as his muzzle shrank into a stubby thing with a pink nose on it. When the smoke cleared, both women stared at him in disbelief.
"What?"
he asked, but held his throat when he found that his draconic voice remained.
"Wait, my voice did not change? Something is wrong."
He poured at himself, crawling towards Azurea and Eureka. Finally finding his center, he stood to look himself over, but at his full height he only came up to their waists.
"Oh, no."
Both women helplessly burst into peals of laughter.
Oh, Searanox, you're a wee bunny boy.
Azurea pointed at him, holding her sides and barely able to breathe.
Me lord, you are tiny.
Aurelia had tears streaming from her eyes, bent forward as she held herself. Suddenly the two dragons were not so terrifying when they looked like rabbit folk. Searanox the Feared had become a rabbit folk child to boot. The former great red looked himself over. He was black-furred, covered with white splotches, the size of a child. He grumbled, trying to see if he could make a smaller voice kick in.
"I may have written the runes incorrectly, Azurea,"
he said, inspecting his armband closely. He'd become small and fuzzy, but his voice was still draconic.
"I shall have to be silent when we visit the rabbit folk," Searanox sighed.
Me lord and lady, before we go,
Aurelia said with a sort of sympathetic smile.
Perhaps clothes would be advisable?
She gestured to their naked fuzzy bodies, quite nude. As dragons wore no clothing, and there was nothing to convert clothing by the armbands. They looked down at themselves, knowing she was right.
"We will visit one of the mundane item rooms,"
Searanox said, turning on his heel. Both women giggled uncontrollably, seeing his black, fuzzy cotton ball tail. He glared them into silence, and they went to search the storerooms for anything they might wear. "Azurea, why does Axemis have that massive horn on the front of his head?" Searanox asked, tugging at the collar of the throw-on shirt he'd selected. Clothes felt constraining to a dragon, much less a dragon that had been shrunken into a child's body.
"None of the other cloud dragons I've seen have that."
He made a rhino's horn shape with his hands, frowning at the pink pads in the palms.
Actually, I'm pretty sure it's a deformity,
Azurea said thoughtfully, swishing her skirts back and forth. She couldn't deny that the rabbit folk could make interesting things out of fabric, but the fact that they wanted to cover everything up with it mystified her. How did one select a mate, or check for bodily sicknesses, or compare oneself to others with clothing on?
Sky dragons are born with a horn on their faces, but it's used to break out of our eggs. Then it itches like mad and we break them off by rubbing our faces on hard things.
She made the appropriate motions.
Some parents even keep their hatchlings' egg horns as mementos.
"And his... what, did not come off?"
The great red, now rabbit folk child, cocked his head, a wry smile coming to his face. Oh, he hoped to see Axemis again, just so that he could call him horny. Azurea shrugged a bit, and he frowned.
"Well, it grew with the rest of him into a ramming weapon,"
he admitted, brow furrowing.
"If it is he who hides in the village, we will still need to work together to kill him."
Kill him?
Aurelia piped softly.
Are all three of you going to fight in the village?
She gasped, frightened at the very thought.
Not if we can help it. If we even find a dragon hiding in this village, of course.
Azurea looked meaningfully at Searanox, who just looked away.
Besides, this does not mean that we would kill whoever it is. A warning would do just fine.
I prefer to kill whoever it is, Searanox said hotly. I do not appreciate my dragon's territory being invaded by the uninvited. There remains plaster my mountain and my yard. That should be warning enough.
The Great Red had been growing more and more grouchy as they came to the foot of the mountain. A road opened up, more visible from the tiny perspective of the rabbit folk. Searanox marvelled a little, for there was a thin path that led right up to his mountain lair. It was just too small for him to find as a dragon. Growling, he made sure Azurea saw it too.
Interesting that I have had so many guests since you arrived months ago, Azurea, he commented, pointing. It seems that a path got carved right up to our home.
He leaned, pressing on a log to hide the path a bit better. It moved easily, much to his approval. His disguise was faulty, but at least his fault was a good advantage. He could simply manhandle the pretender out of the village, if worse came to worse.
What makes you think that Axemis is the one hiding in the town? And don't say you don't. You started talking about him as soon as we set out,
Azurea said, frowning at him.
Remember when we defeated Axemis some weeks ago?
Searanox said thoughtfully.
I crippled his wing and he fled on foot.
He glanced over at both women to be sure they were following.
As I understand it, the Sky Dragon territories are very, very far away from here, even on the wing, he explained. If a dragon went crawling across the countryside on the ground, the uproar would be so massive that even we would have heard about it, not to mention your pet, Auriella.
Azurea knew that he had a point. A dragon travelling across most of the region on foot would certainly spin the rumour mill. Auriella nodded at his logic as well.
Which means...
Searanox let it hang.
Axemis never left. Not really,
Azurea said, frowning from under her eyebrows as her head tilted down.
He donned a disguise and holed up at the rabbit folk town, right under our noses.
They came to the cusp of the village, where a pair of children ran by with bushels of hay. The houses were squat, simple things of brick and straw roofs. The roads were nicely paved with white stone cobble. As the trio came into town, they slipped easily into the hustle and bustle of the market day. There were carts, open-wall stores, and plenty of rabbit folk with carpets rolled out displaying their wares. Azurea put her finger over her lips to silence Searanox, whose draconic voice would have given them away as unusual.
Well, Auriella?
Azurea asked as they looked around curiously.
Where do you look for something unusual in a town of rabbit folk? Strangers? Well...
Auriella peered about the busy marketplace.
Like I said, the one who bought the painting was pretty unremarkable. I might walk past him and not even notice.
She wilted a little when she said it aloud, both dragons sighing at her.
It was just a coin. Perhaps there's no one here at all.
She was genuinely upset at having no answer for her masters.
No, dragons do not give out dragon money for the mortal races. Either this person was either a dragon slayer or a dragon himself.
It was okay for Azurea to speak aloud in the crowded streets, for the dull roar of laughter and trading covered their conversation.
If it was truly Axemis, of course all he would have with him is draconic money. The only question is, where would one look in order to find a...
She stopped when she saw Searanox pressing his face against the glass of a shop window. Madame Hircher's Enchantments and Mysteries. His bunny tail twitched a few times with interest, and Azurea could not help but giggle at him.
You want to go in there?
She asked, putting a hand on his shoulder. He looked at her with a scowly, frowny face that was simply adorable on a rabbit child his size. Both women chuckled aloud, and he made an angry gesture at them that did not look so adorable on a rabbit child his size, then heading inside very quickly. Surely their search wasn't in a rush. They could stop to see the things here and there. Searanox stopped just inside the door, staring up at the suit of armor covered in runes. At first it looked scratched up, but a keener eye would tell that this one was magically inclined. All the scratches were lines, and lines of funny marks and symbols. Searanox leaned in close, rapping sharply on it. It rang in a hollow manner, and he seemed offended at its very existence. Azurea looked at him, then at the armor. Standing before it, she extended her awareness forward. Closing her eyes and resting her paws on the breastplate, she allowed the cobwebby presence of her magics to flow forward. Dragon's Bane. The entire thing was a blazing neon sign that read Dragon's Bane. The entire armored shell would give fantastic protection against dragons.
What's this thing doing just sitting here?
Azurea wondered, aghast as she opened her eyes.
No one's bought it yet, of course. Enchanted material is expensive.
The old hag of a rabbit folk woman shuffled out of the shacks and aisles. Her eyes were milky and her cheeks sagged, telling of a great many seasons had come and gone. But the tiny glasses on her muzzle twinked with her inner light. She blinked at the three of them, and suddenly bowed her head low. Her fingers rushed together.
I can see you, great ones.
She stuttered. Azurea took a step back, with Searanox.
My spectacles are enchanted to see you, and... Where did you get this?
Azurea leaned forward aggressively, pointing at the suit of armor. In the lenses of the old shopkeeper's glasses, she could see the twinge of blue, so it really was showing the viewer what they really were.
It was a foreign import. I bought it off the off chance that a dragon slayer might...
She trailed off, her sagging ears turning backward in a sort of horrified expression. A little rabbit boy stood before her, looking certifiably ticked off.
Might buy it and kill me.
He spoke aloud after making sure that the shop door was closed.
Foolish creature.
He aggressively reached up to snap her neck on the spot, but Azurea stopped him. She shook her head with a pleading expression. He gritted his teeth at her, and lowered his hand. He cursed the moment he'd promised not to harm the rabbit folk in this town, for, Azurea or no, just one surely wouldn't hurt the entire town. Folding his arms with a seething scowl, he went to wander amongst the stacks of oddities while Azurea tried communication instead.
Your spectacles have some sort of true sight upon them?
The dragoness asked, squinting at the glasses themselves. The old withered woman nodded dumbly, still quivering. 2 dragons in her very shop.
That's very convenient.
Azurea reached out and simply plucked them off her face.
Hey!
She said, reaching with her bony hands.
I'm blind without them, truly blind.
She clutched at the air as Azurea moved quickly away. Her milky eyes searched around, but she saw only blackness.
I made those after my eyes went bad. Please don't take them, masters,
she pleaded, staggering until Auriella rushed to catch her.
We are going to borrow these,
Azurea said, smirking as a plan formed.
Borrow them? Whatever for?
She said, as Auriella quickly guided her to a stool for her to sit.
Don't worry, I'll return them,
Azurea promised.
In exchange for not stealing them outright, you'll tell no one you saw us here today.
There wasn't much negotiation to be had, for her tone was final. Smirking, she went to find Searanox.
Come on, Searanox, let's...
She'd lost track of him. Panicking briefly, she turned about this way and that.
Searanox!
She gave a shrieking whisper. A small rabbit boy was at the window, frowning out it. He pointed silently, the regular scowl on his face from before. Auriella and Azurea leaned to see, and saw that the window looked into the window across the way, into a local tavern. There, a rabbit man was winning. He slammed their fists down upon the table, coughing loudly. The gathered crowd burst into cheers that the 3 of them could not hear on the other side of the building, and money changed hands all around him. The rabbit men poke the table aggressively, and a stack of golden coins got shoved his way. Then another, even bigger rabbit man sat across from him. He met the same fate, slammed out of his chair and to the ground in a very short arm wrestling match.
Well, that's, unusual.
Auriella ventured, meekly, pointing at the odd spectacle.
That must be him.
Azurea frowned darkly, pulling up the spectacles. She lifted them to her eyes and peered at the figure. The strong man had great leathery blue wings, sprouting out of his back and shirt. Ethereal and not quite real.
Oh, yes.
She trailed off, for his right wing was scar-torn and a little melted with burn scars. She looked down when Searanox tugged silently on her skirts. He held up his hand, palm up.
What?
She asked. He made a few gestures, pawing at the pouch on her hip. She slipped it open, and he fished inside, pulling out the platinum coin. With that, he made a beeline for the door.
Thank you for visiting my humble shop. Oh, great ones.
The old woman almost fell over herself when the trio swept past her.
I'll finally have something to brag to my sons about. You didn't see any dragons.
Azurea leaned and snarled, putting the glasses back on her nose.
Perhaps you didn't hear me the first time.
The elder woman quivered and quickly leaned on a nearby shelf, stuttering an apology. Satisfied, Azurea turned to follow Searanox.
I'm telling you, this guy's won almost 30 matches in a row, and no one's beaten him yet.
One of the rabbit folk said to another as the trio came discreetly into the tavern.
There must be something magical about him. No, that's stupid. Look, he's bare-chested and he's not even wearing a cloak.
His friend said back to him. The crowd let out an "oh" when another strong man was easily felled, and another 10 gold was stacked onto the stranger's pile.
If he was augmented with magical items, we'd see them.
The two of them squinted at the unusual stranger, a white-furred rabbit man with a bizarre blue streak of dye across his chest. Dyeing fur was so far out of style it was staggering, but it certainly made him stand out.
Who's next?
The man guffawed, shaking his head at an offer of mead. Snatching instead a wine bottle from the next table over, he glared the patron into submission when he stood to reclaim it, for no man had yet to fell him in brute strength.
Oh, come now. There must be someone that I haven't beaten.
He was having far too good a time, for his cheeks were pink, and his swagger all too loosened up. He wasn't wine-touched, but he was certainly drunk on victories. A platinum coin landed on the table before him, ringing with the distinct sound of currency that only dragons could hear. The near-silent call of raw wealth that could turn a dragon's stomach with hoard lust. There were gasps. A platinum coin! Who'd be so foolish? The crowd parted, revealing a short little boy with a deep scowl on his face. The entire room burst into roars of laughter and pointing.
Oh God, I'm going to pee myself.
One man begged, leaning hard onto his friend.
I can't breathe. I can't breathe.
The black-furred boy had white splotches and rather tight-looking dress shirt and slacks. Oddly dressed, for the late summer season, he was. Flanked by a pair of women no one knew, he crossed the wood plank floor with a slow and even pace.
Lad, you're gonna get hurt. Where did you get all that money anyway? Don't you know how much a platinum coin is worth?
The powerful rabbit man chuckled aloud. Even their children came bearing coin to lose. It was just too easy. He watched the lad take a seat while the women stood behind him on either side. One looked angry, the other afraid. What an odd trio they made. Ah well, he didn't care. The money was real. He could tell by the shine of the metal alone. Just a flicking glance was enough.
Very well, young man. You can try your best.
He lifted an arm with a grin that came from under his eyebrows. The young man lifted a bony arm and gently took his hand, making sure the sleeve was back. Slam! The strong man flew across the room, through a table and into a set of shelves. Trays, glass mugs, and waiting food showered him. The room went dead silent. Beer sprang out of the mouths and trays, dropping out of the hands of barmaidens. They all stared at the wreckage as the great strong man emerged, looking furious.
Hey, I wasn't ready,
he quickly said, eyeing his challenger with a more critical eye. That hadn't just happened. He must have pulled the wrong way for some insane reason and tossed himself. He growled openly when the boy reached across the table with a greedy little paw, pulling 100 golden coins across to himself. He didn't count them, just pulled the right amount. Only dragons could count gold that accurately without checking it. He seated himself across from the lad, growling again. All attention was on the two at the table now, both women looking around nervously. The scowl on the boy's face deepened.
Is that kid possessed? Did you see that? I'm not drunk enough for shit like this to be happening.
There was a mattering of whispers as the two re-evaluated each other. The boy reached to the middle of the table, to the platinum coin. He turned the coin over, a dragon's head. The strong man's eyes narrowed. Azurea's eyes narrowed. This was their target. He knew the coin was his own.
Something you're not telling us, son?
The man ventured, reaching across the table and shoving a new stack of 100 gold coin to the middle. They were going to go again. He reached across the table, arm angled. The boy's face turned hateful, wretched and pissed off.
If I didn't know better, I'd say you were.
Slam. Searanox broke the table in half, spilling the money everywhere with the back of his opponent's fist. The ringing of precious metal was all the man heard as he was sent, quite literally, through the floor. A wine cellar below caught him, in a way. The boy's hand launched forward, snatching the platinum coin out of the air before it rolled away like the rest. There was a mad scramble as the money went everywhere. Azurea put a hand on Searanox's tiny shoulder, giving him a very angry look. He turned his nose up at her.
They can use the money to repair the place,
he whispered lowly over the madness and rushing grabby paws. Standing slowly from the wooden chair, the boy hopped down the hall. Azurea sighed in exasperation, turning to look for stairs. Taking Auriella by the paw, she rushed to find the basement.
I am not happy,
Searanox said to the slowly emerging figure that was now covered in expensive drink.
It is one thing to trespass, but to take gold out from under my nose, from the people I steal it from, is something else entirely.
His draconic voice betrayed his true nature, and the strong rabbit wiped his bleeding mouth as he staggered to his feet.
I believe we bested you and sent you away last we met.
You can't blame a dragon for playing with the locals while he waits. My wing is almost better, by the way. Thank you for asking. The rabbit folk tone had fallen away. It was the voice of Axemis, aristocratic dragon of the Western Sky Dragon family. Searanox cracked his knuckles, starting forward. I was going to wait until I was healed to challenge you again, but I suppose now I will have to. No longer to be played the fool by appearances, Axemis leaned back and then rammed Searanox with his forehead. The great red saw white spots, staggering dumbly. It seemed that both of them had disguises that allowed their draconic strength to remain. Such tectonic force. Azurea and Auriella wheeled around the outside of the tavern. The wine cellar needed to be accessed from outside. The double doors were padlocked. Azurea leaned, making sure no one was watching. Panting, she snapped the lock sharply in her hands, throwing the door open.
Auriella, find a safe place to hide. This may turn ugly,
she ordered her pet, who fled very promptly. Not giving an inch of recovery time, Axemis charged headlong into Searanox. The crack of bone on bone with draconic force behind it would have slain even the most hard-headed rabbit folk in the world. Instead, It sent them both reeling directly into the master column and the beam of the wine cellar. The building shuddered and began to fall. Azurea felt the building start to collapse and flung herself backward as it all came down.
Searanox!
She shrieked in terror. Act 2, Part 5. Fury. Axemis emerged from the wreckage, a little stunned. His hard head and thick skull plating had saved him from the falling building, even in the rabbit folk form. The splintered wood was no match for his draconic strength. Hacking the dirt and dust that rained over him, he pushed his way out into the side alleyway.
My gods, are you okay, mister?
Someone pointed and a small crowd rushed to meet him. He staggered a little, but shook his head to regain himself.
The building just came down. I saw it happen. Never seen anything like it.
Axemis sensed the oncoming attack far too late, as someone's shoulder buried itself in the small of his back. He flew forward, bowling over the peasants as he pitched over the ground like a skipping stone. He crashed into the town's well with a doggish cry, a dog that needed to be put down. Azurea parted the crowd forcefully, out for blood. They could do nothing but watch in amazement as she strode up to him as quickly as her skirts would allow her to. Teeth clenched, she was soon upon him. He looked up just in time to be grabbed by the throat and lifted into the air with both paws.
How many times do I need to choke you before you get the hint?
Azurea spat upon him. Their sheer height difference only brought Axemis a few inches off the ground, so the pads of his feet scraped the earth back and forth. His head suddenly came down, his forehead ramming into her soft muzzle with a crack. Azurea squawked as bones broke and she released him, staggering back and holding her face. Blood poured out between her fingers and she moaned incoherently. "At least once more, my betrothed," Axemis said nastily, rubbing his neck and checking the wreckage of the building with a flick of his eyes. He could sense no movement, no powerful magics. Satisfied that Searanox was felled, he grinned suddenly from his eyebrows. "Let us end this charade." He reached and drew odd symbols in mid-air with his fingertips, runes of magic. He thrust his arms to the sky, tilting his head back as his wings sprouted. They exploded from his back and his skin twinged blue as his teeth exploded with length. He moaned and roared at the pain of the transformation. It was shoddy magic, unlike the armbands. Thrashing back and forth, he gagged and gasped with effort while the rabbit folk around him began to retreat backward in terror. Axemis's face hardened and his snout protruded sharply, a massive horn jutting forth like a rhino's weapon. Finally, he was fully dragon again, a sky dragon the size of Searanox the Feared. The crowd screamed and fled in terror as he gave a triumphant roar. Azurea leaned on the water well, glaring at him through the blood that poured onto her hand and spattered her dress. Looking back and forth while the denizens fled, she scrambled for a plan. Any plan. Anything to kill Axemis. There would be no stopping or reasoning with him at this point. Searanox was dead, or at least down for the moment. Her options were so limited.
I am not some helpless rabbit folk wench,
she growled feverishly through her broken nose, shaking her head firmly.
The fairy tales are wrong. It doesn't take a goddamn knight to slay a dragon, and I'll prove it.
Reaching over with a bloody hand, she tapped her golden armband twice.
Cuniculus.
She was shrouded in a blue smoke as she exploded back into her draconic form, roaring as her wings stretched and her claws hooked out again. As a ray of the blue sky stepped forth to challenge Axemis, a line of blood from her cracked muzzle spattering the ground. Thank the gods the broken nose had not carried over into a draconic form for some reason.
Azurea!
Someone in the screaming, panicked crowd shouted.
It's Azurea of the blue sky!
Someone else stopped to point.
Protect us, Azurea! Protect us!
The trio of children suddenly leapt into the middle of the road, hopping up and down.
You save us from Searanox's fires! Protect us!
The scattering of encouragements was slowly growing into a wave of massive roaring cheers. Aximus and Azurea both looked back and forth in some confusion. It occurred to Azurea that she'd saved the village several times in the past few months, was known to sit and stare at it from up on high, and had stopped Searanox from destroying it twice already. The rabbit folk thought her a saviour?
Azurea! Azurea! Azurea!
They were chanting from the alleys, from the windows, and from their hiding places. Aximus's maw split, showing off his massive teeth as blue lightning arced into a random building and exploded it into countless wooden shards. The cheering and chanting turned to screams of terror as bodies flew into pieces, end over end in a concussive blast. Rabbit folk milled about, deafened by the blast of lightning. Aximus roared, stomping the ground aggressively. Azurea looked around in a mild panic, astounded at the raw power that the elder dragon could simply breathe upon his enemies. She was immune to his lightning breath because of her scales, being a sky dragon herself, but that didn't speak for anything else. They could not fight here. The townsfolk were too vulnerable. "Hey, Aximus!" Azurea turned most of the way around, flicking her tail up a little. This, of course, caught his gaze. "If you felled Searanox, doesn't that mean that his lair and treasures are yours now?" she shouted over the panicked, milling rabbit folk. She lifted her tail a bit more and flashed him despite herself, then took a wing with all her might. Azurea rode the air currents out of the village, labouring high into the sky and back towards the mountain. Aximus's wings flipped open, and he grunted in pain when he tried to take off. He gazed at his shoulder and wing membranes, still knitting from when Searanox had shot him down with a fireball. He snarled viciously, checking the wreckage of the collapsed building. Still no movement. He was definitely dead, and good riddance. He would have to crawl upon the ground like a sand dragon, at least for now. Folding his wings hard against him, he lowered his massive face horn and charged like a mad beast. Rushing towards the mountain, he felled trees, ran over beasts, and split boulders as he went. Azurea panicked as she flew as fast as she could. She'd saved the rabbit folk from Aximus, but what about herself? She couldn't kill something time and a half her own size. She tried very hard not to think of Searanox's fate while she folded her wings into a nosedive. Landing hard in the ashy front yard of the lair, she ran quickly inside. Mind in a whirl, she found herself in the hoard room. Searanox didn't keep any dragon weapons like sky dragons did, nor did he have armors. Not that she could fit into something his size, of course. Huffing in slight hyperventilation, she kept turning in quick circles. Surely he had some defenses. Ah! Her mind suddenly snapped back to Searanox's journal. She'd pored through it and learned all of the command words that the lair had to offer. All the Great Red's magical items were tied to spoken commands and force of will. She wouldn't have long to prepare. Aximus did not take long to find the entrance of the mountain lair. Just follow the stench of smoke and death, and there it was. Knocking on one tree over another that blocked his way for good measure, he set paw upon the ashy yard. It was quiet, far too quiet for a place waiting for an attack. Azurea was far smaller than he, but he was no fool either. Surely a cave dragon had a lair with some sort of defences. He'd not been inside during his last visit, but he would not put it past the Great Red to booby-trap his own home. Staring silently, a light wind pushed over a rusty sword that had been sticking out of the ground. Aximus's eyes narrowed as he slowly strode across the yard, dragging his tail. Littering one's yard with fallen foes was a very aggressive stance to take in the draconic world. Yet here Searanox the Feared had displayed them like trophies. A slight sinking in the ground drew his attention, and he stopped, backing up a bit in case of a trap. Leaning in, he blew upon the ground sharply. A blue dragon's skull stared up at him. No, 2 of them. Axemis backed up a little, looking up at the mountain in horror. He gasped loudly, for a 3rd cloud dragon's remains were plastered over the mountainside itself, bleached white by the unforgiving sun. Clenching his teeth to steady himself, he growled savagely and walked slowly around the remains. He would give his fallen brethren a proper burial, after he'd fetched his betrothed. They would not have died in vain, trying to snatch what was rightfully his from the monster of Searanox the Feared. Shivering in anger, he did not feel satisfied that he'd simply crushed the Great Red to death while he was in rabbit form. He'd wanted glorious battle, to win back Azurea of the blue sky as his... Wait, blue dragons did not have titles. How stupid! He'd been around the town for too long, listening to their silly gossip. He shook his head, snorting hot steam from his slitted nostrils. I shall teach her more than her proper name when she's recovered, he promised himself, with a raunchy growl. I shall teach her mine. He found himself at the lip of the cave, looking back and forth. If there was any place most likely to be booby-trapped, it was the very outermost threshold of a dragon's lair, and he was no fool. Silex valve, a female voice within hissed. Suddenly a thick slab of stone slammed down, blocking the entire entrance. Axemis rather comically hit his nose upon it, snuffing and backing up a moment. Insulted, he growled and rammed his horn into it. Cracks worked across the surface, but it held. 3, 4, 5 increasingly hard attacks weakened the slab covering the cave entrance, but it would not move. Snarling, Axemis backed up, all the way across the ashen yard. Lowering his horn, he clawed the ground a few times to get his traction. The ashy ground made it hard, especially with bits of metal and bone debris everywhere. Clearing out a path with angry patience, he lowered himself once more and charged forth. The impact was almost concussive, but his powerful horn held. While he saw spots for a moment, he shook his head and saw the massive crack he'd forced along the slab. Digging his claws into it, he viciously scratched and pulled until a large portion came away. Using his horn, he rammed the rest out of the way. I will not be denied, Azurea, he roared into the tunnel's mouth. Starting forward with a growl, stomping loudly along, he followed the dark tunnel forward. Little torches came on automatically as he passed them, bursting into flame that gave off no heat. Impressive, he thought, that Searanox the Feared had been so wealthy he had ever burning torches even in front of his tunnel. He emerged into the hoard room, and his eyes widened. The sheer wealth, the sheer draconic wealth. It turned his very stomach, stirring hoard lust and so much more within him. His heart thundered in his ears, and he smiled dumbly at all the finery. Searanox's hoard was massive, so very massive. It stretched across the open space in a carpet of golden gems. It mounded here and there like beautiful dunes of the desert. It was speckled with chests and containers, no doubt holding more treasure. Axemis ran his paw over the cool touch of gold, picking up a handful and sprinkling it upon the ground like yellow sand. And it's all mine, he murmured, with a half-dragon drunken snort of glee. This had to be the best day of his life. It had to be. He'd slain his enemy, was about to reclaim his betrothed, and had inherited by right the biggest hoard he'd ever seen or heard of in his life. A great greedy grin split his maw. "It's all mine," he said again, joyous. Azurea's head popped out of a mound of golden coins. "Silex!" she snapped. Suddenly a stalactite dislodged itself and fell upon Axemis from the ceiling. He roared in pain and confusion, knocked down and unbraced for the assault. The point had cracked the scales upon his back. Another like that and he would be impaled. The blue dragoness exploded from the mound of gold and gems with a roar of fury, leaping upon him with all her might. He took her weight with ease, rearing up and throwing her against the wall. She yelped on impact, righting herself and running along the wall like a mad gecko. He watched her with some confusion, turning slowly away as his tail whipped about. "Silex! Silex!" she snapped. Axemis rolled, throwing himself quickly to one side as more sharp stalactites fell from the ceiling, spearing mounds of gold with their weight. "Silex!" The blue dragoness rained ungodly, sharp-stoned hell upon her opponent as he desperately flung himself back and forth. Searanox's lair was heavily booby-trapped, and not just at the entrance. Leaping, Axemis rammed his head through one of the falling stalactites, peppering Azurea with the debris. She screeched ferally, knocked off of the wall and falling in a mess of limbs and wings. Charging forward with his horn lowered, Axemis rammed her into the wall. She gave a belting cry on impact, bouncing off the wall and onto her belly. Flailing about with her claws, she savagely reared up upon him like an angry mountain cat. Her tail whipped around, the sonic boom of the whip-like motion stinging his face and sending blood across the ground. He shrieked, backing up a step or two. It was like wading into a maelstrom. He could not get near her without charging outright, and that might kill her. They squared off, snarling and snapping at each other, slowly circling. "Your first mistake was running away, my Azurea. I'll have to take your discipline out of your hide, so you will learn your place," he hissed at her, flaring his wings aggressively like a dancing cobra. "We are creatures of the sky and clouds. You'll learn for laying with monsters and skulking in darkness," he roared. "Better to lay with monsters than to sit with snakes, Axemis. At least the monsters have nothing to hide. Silex!" Azurea sent Axemis barrel-rolling when another stalactite fell from the ceiling, splitting the mounds of gold it struck on impact. Coins and gems sprayed in every direction. Axemis barely had time to recover as Azurea approached him from sideways, her tail whip cracking back and forth like a lion tamer. He took 3 strikes to the chest and face before he started backing up in a low arch. She drove him around the room with a furious expression of gritted teeth and powerful effort. She was so much stronger than he remembered. Living in the wild with Searanox had made her powerful. After some time he gained her rhythm and made a grab with both paws. Azurea yelped as she was hauled backward by her tail, and Axemis flung himself forward to pin her with his sheer weight. With her tail grasped, pressed up against her back, icy terror flooded through Azurea as Axemis squirmed atop her. She shrieked ferally, trying to flap her wings and roaring at him over her shoulder. His head raised like a massive weight, and he bludgeoned her with his massive horn. She fell, stunned, blinking rapidly to regain her vision. His claws greedily ran over her body as he pressed up against her, growling in that lusty way that only a male knows how. Clenching her teeth, she summoned all her rage and click! An arc of lightning blasted forth from her maw, straight into Axemis's face. He brunted the assault, immune to lightning because he too was a sky dragon. Rearing up once more, his massive horn bashed against the side of her head. She limpened as her temple bled, stunned and exhausted. She squirmed, but could not fight him any more. "No," she whimpered as he began to force himself upon her. She would not cry. She would not give him the satis. The explosion that rocked the mountain lair was enough to stun them both. A great and fiery presence was melting its way up the tunnel like magma. Both of their heads turned. Dragon fear. Immeasurable dragon fear. Searanox awoke in a strange half-light, pressed down from all sides. When he tried to move, he could not do so very much. He was pinned under some sort of shell. No, half of a barrel. A keg had split itself in the wreckage, and flipped down upon him like a shield. There were beams and debris scattered everywhere that he could see. Little blips of sunlight moved back and forth, and he could hear voices outside. Rabbit folk voices. Blinking a few times, he looked down at himself to check for injury, and saw that he too was rabbit folk. Suddenly everything came rushing back to him.
Axemis, he snarled viciously. I've had quite enough of this.
His brow furrowed down as he began to push his way out, but it was hard to move and wiggle in such a tiny body, even if he still had his draconic strength. Rapidly growing frustrated, he finally forced his paw round to his shoulder where the golden band on his arm was. Cuniculus! He exploded with sighs, sending splinters and mortar in every direction as he rose up out of the depths of the wine cellar like a demon.
It's a demon! It's a monster!
The townspeople were running in terror.
Haven't we had enough beasts in the village today? Surely the gods have cursed us.
They milled about like frightened beasts, not sure where there was a good spot to hide from the red dragon, who was crashing his way out of the ruins of the tavern. Searanox shook his great head back and forth to cast off the wood chunks and debris from his mane and wing membranes. When the villagers at last recognized him, it was that much worse.
Searanox the Feared! Run! Run for your lives! Azurea cannot protect us!
There was hysterical screaming as hiding places became no longer an option. People were taking off through the woods, grabbing children, whatever they could carry, and leaving their village for destroyed. Searanox the Feared was sitting in their very square. Searanox was pleased, to say the least. Finally, some respect. He peered about, looking for any signs of Azurea and Axemis. He saw the exploded building, eyeing the scorch marks. Fire didn't make such burning motions. That had been lightning breath. Suddenly, the Great Red spotted 3 rabbit folk staring up at him in wonder, by the well. It was the 3 children from before. He recalled having seen them once or twice before, and Azurea had mentioned them as well. The children that were either touched in the head, or just didn't understand fear yet. He loomed over them like a great apocalyptic shadow. They looked up at him, clinging to each other as his dragon fear bubbled on the surface around him.
Where has Azurea of the blue sky gone?
He asked them, leaning down and snorting hot steam over the 3 of them. Shivering and trying to stay upright between the 3 of them, they pointed towards the mountain lair.
And the horny one, Axemis?
He growled, leaning closer. His vanished pupils made his eyes look like pools of glowing orange lava. They pointed again to the mountain. Searanox backed up a few steps, as not to step on the 3 of them.
Gather your people, little rabbit children. Your village is safe from Searanox the Feared. For now.
He spread his wings, whipping open to blot out the almighty sun, and he took wing. The 3 children looked at each other, and then took off in different directions to obey. Rabbit folk children did run very fast, after all. A short time later, Searanox growled as he flew over the ashy veil that was his front yard. There were great paw prints pressed heavily into the ash, and most of his lawn decorations had been moved around to make a path. The blue dragon's skulls had been uncovered as well. The dragon's yard was his statement to the outer world, and now his was defiled. Snarling grumpily, he rumbled across the yard and startled to a stop for a moment. His rock door command word had been used? He studied the debris, for the massive slab of rock had been destroyed by blunt force.
Azurea,
he said, nodding in mild approval. The Great Red's eyes perked as the sonic boom of whips cracking rolled down out of the cave. Narrowing his eyes, he frowned deeply. Azurea's tail made that sound when she hit things with it. Running the chain of events through his mind, He recalled that he'd been defeated by Axemis, and that his hoard had been up for grabs because of it. But with Azurea being there, that meant... Searanox's tail blade sprang open with the sound of drawing swords, and he rushed forward through the tunnel. He heard the impactive, whumping sound, followed by a yelp. Then the tunnel flashed white and the great red stopped, momentarily blinded. Lightning. It was the smell of summer lightning. They were fighting. Another heavy whumping sound, followed by a second yelp. No! He heard Azurea's voice float up the tunnel. She had never had such a pathetic, weak tone to her voice. Clenching his teeth when he could see again, Searanox's rage enveloped him like a thick cloak. It boiled and frothed, churning inside his very being until it filled the void within him. Then it exploded outward like a silent, concussive roll of thunder. It rattled the cave as he powered forward. Dragon fear. Axemis would learn the meaning of fear. He emerged over the crest of the tunnel and into the hoard room, black wings open as he concussed the entire cave with a roar of challenge. The mountain shuddered in fear as the mounds of coins pitched themselves over before him. His eyes flickered down over the scene. A bleeding from the head Azurea, forced down on her belly with her tail pressed up against her back. Upon her was Axemis, his member hanging low and his face horn spattered with her blood. He was holding her down with his sheer size and weight, about to rape her. Both were staring at him with mixed expressions of fear. Dragon fear. You will all fear me. Searanox hissed as he lowered his wings and then charged forth. Axemis turned and tossed Azurea hard against a wall by her tail. She struck it with heavy impact, yelping and crumpling in a mess of limp wings. She lay unmoving. Searanox ran over to Axemis just as the horn blue turned to face him, ramming into his side with all his weight. He belted out a grunt of pain, rolling uncontrollably until he hit a wall. Click! Fireballs peppered the wall as Searanox made no stop for words. Axemis brunted what he could with his massive horn, knocking aside one or two as he took the heat. Opening his maw, he returned fire, a blast of lightning arcing from his mouth with a deafening roar of thunder. The great red cried out as his body seized up from the jolt, stunned for a moment. Axemis lowered his horn and charged like an angry rhino, roaring his challenge. Searanox dug his claws into the gems neath his feet and charged with all he had. They met like charging rams. Coins, gems, and other finery rushed away from them in a great circle, showering the room with ringing moneys. Axemis overtook Searanox with the size of his horn, and they tangled, rolling viciously about in a mess of claws and teeth. Searanox grabbed Axemis's massive horn, steered his face, and dragged it along the ground with all his might. The great blue shrieked and cried out as sharp gems dug into his eyes and mouth, cutting him mercilessly. He gave a great toss of his head, knocking Searanox aside. The cave shuddered as they squared off once more.
I was going to make a horny joke, but it's hardly appropriate anymore.
Searanox huffed with something between exhilaration and madness.
But there'll be no walking away from rape, Axemis.
He spat blood on the ground, something in his muzzle injured from when they butted heads.
You can't rape what's rightfully yours.
Axemis checked his horn, for it was battered from the vicious fighting.
She belongs to me, along with everything else in this cave. You've got balls. I'll admit, walking into another dragon's lair like you own the place.
Searanox was waiting for his fiery breath to return, for he could only use it so often. But that would also be true for Axemis's lightning breath.
But none walk from battling Searanox the Feared.
His inner kiln clicked, and a jet of fire sprayed across the room in a straight line. Axemis was engulfed in flames.
lightning arcing forth to split the fire down the middle until both cancelled each other out. Both dragons rushed forth again, head-butting one another fiercely. Searanox saw the white spots, his crown of horns unable to stand up to Aximus's massive frontal horn. Aximus twisted, trying to impale the great red's chest. He struck true, ripping away the fake scales and revealing Searanox's heart. The massive gem glittered in the half-light. The blue dragon hesitated for a moment, eyeballing it. "I was using the painting for a dartboard at the tavern. I thought the heart was just artistic choice." Aximus marvelled at the gem for a few moments. "But I see it's just your weak spot now." He lowered his horn, digging his claws into the ground to charge. Searanox roared his challenge, remembering what had happened the last time Aximus had charged straight into his heart. Bracing for impact, he coiled his body and threw his chest out. The blue giant charged forward, roaring mightily as he crashed straight into Searanox's chest. Bone met stone. Aximus's horn shattered off of his nose, spinning and striking the ground. He reeled at the lack of his weight, staggering and tossing his head in a panic. Searanox turned, slapping him with his tail blades. The spray of blood on his face was satisfying. "Perhaps you did not know. Gems are far harder than bone." Another slashing strike as Searanox turned sideways to fight with his tail. Unlike with Azurea, there was no size difference, and Aximus could not make a grab for it with any hope of pulling the great red along. That tail was covered with sharpened edges, which would have gone straight through his hands. So Searanox slashed back and forth, steering Aximus around the room with pain and blood. Aximus was losing badly, his horn gone and his wings flightless. He turned to fight with his tail, but Searanox would not allow it. He peppered Aximus's side with heavy wounds when he presented a bigger target, turning sideways and blasting flame across his face. Aximus roared, holding his burning face, and arced lightning without looking to aim. The blast went over Searanox's shoulder and into the ceiling, blowing a great hole and making rocks fall. The mountain shuddered again. Leaping upon his enemy, Searanox went for the killing blow. Thinner scales around his neck. His jaws locked around Aximus's neck as he overpowered him with his momentum and weight. Casting the writhing thing upon his back, the great red chewed viciously. Flesh tore and scales shattered like crystals upon pavement. Pieces flew this way and that as Aximus pitched into his death throes, clawing and biting at anything that he could reach, but Searanox had him by the throat. Finally finding the hold he wanted, the great red made a jerking motion. Blood spattered fantastically across several feet of carpet of finery in the hoard. Searanox let go of the slowing Aximus, gore dripping from his mouth. His wings were flapping weakly, fluttering as he struggled to try and crawl away. Fountains of blood were gushing from his wounds, and Searanox knocked him down again for good measure. The blue looked up at the mighty red, begging mercy with his eyes, for he could not speak with his throat ripped out. He gurgled quietly, tears streaming down his muzzle. Click. Flames rushed across the body, enveloping Aximus in a horrible burning death. The body curled up like a hatchling, blackened, and stopped moving. Searanox shot his fiery breath over it again, pounding it into the ground until the very hoard around it began to melt into a messy golden glob. He breathed flame over it once more, until the bones were exposed, blackened and popping with the sheer heat. He breathed flame a fourth time, shattering the basic shape of the body and rearing up to stomp on it with his massive weight. He breathed flame over it a final time, until the pieces were black blobs of nothingness in a sea of gold and gems. Standing over his kill, Searanox threw his chest out and roared, proclaiming victory to the heavens and anything else within miles that might hear him. Aximus was no more.
Act 2, Part 6, Companion. Azurea could only feel pain, and couldn't see anything. All was darkness. She squirmed a little, gasping. Her tail was tucked down, wrapped artificially around her ankle. She adjusted a little until it was more comfortable, tighter and more tucked. The light in the room was terrible. Gold shifted under her belly.
Azurea?
A male voice made her twitch and panic, her wings flapping upward into someone's face. The memory of Axemis's assault rushed back to her like an icy flood. She let out a screeching, feral cry. "Rapist!" she shrieked, twisting about to attack with everything she could muster. The whole face was palmed by a paw far bigger than she expected. Heat flowed through it, not like a cloud dragon's paw. She whimpered and twisted about until she fell on her side, dizzy from her injuries. Her head hurt, and she could feel the crust of blood on her temples and side.
No, no, my little cloud snapper.
It was a deep, syrupy voice that was edged with concern.
Axemis is no more. I've killed him for you.
Azurea looked up, squinting in the darkness with one eye into the molten gaze of a dragon with no pupils. She let out a little distressed sigh, relieved.
Searanox,
she whispered, as though to assure herself. It's over then? He's dead? She wanted to confirm again. He nodded with a lopsided smile. Well, at least I know you are devoted to your promise. Thank you. The dragoness blinked slowly when his smile turned wider and alarmingly happy. What? What is it? She asked, not wanting to move from where she lay. Nothing. Nothing. He leaned to one side, placing down a haunch of what was once a cow for her.
Can you eat, Azurea? You took a beating. You should eat. You will feel better.
He nosed it at her a few times, like a dog offering to share his most prized bone with a friend.
I hurt all over.
She heaved her breath about halfway, curling a little to put less strain on her lungs.
I hurt,
she moaned a little, shuddering and folding her wings tight. Searanox crooned over her with wordless, growling purr sounds. His wings opened, liquid night, as he nudged the haunch towards her again. He settled next to her, one wing lazily draped over her body. She leaned just a little, chewing the meat carefully to please him. He nodded his approval, dragging his tail blades about in a very Cheshire cat way.
You fought him a long time, all on your own. I saw a lot of the fallen rocks and the rock slab,
Searanox said carefully, praising her. Heat touched her cheeks as he went on.
You were not such a dirty fighter when you first came here.
He smiled, despite himself.
I saw the whipping marks on Axemis too.
The great red grinned when she snapped a bone or two from the cow haunch.
He tried to rape me, Searanox,
she whispered, her voice quivering a bit. The humor fell from the room, but the great red tried to remain soothing.
He did not, though.
And I killed him for you, Searanox reminded her, dragging the hard scales of his chin over her neck a few times, an affectionate gesture to a great red. She smiled just a little. He gestured to a pool of melted gold that was speckled with gems and black blobs of something she couldn't identify.
Very, very dead,
he promised her, draping his paw around her shoulders. Azurea leaned into her champion very suddenly, weeping. His brow went up, as though he'd hurt her, tensing up. But when she buried her muzzle in his chest and put her arms about his front, he relaxed a bit.
Azurea.
Searanox purr-growled softly, draping his wing over the rest of her. She hid from the world, weeping in a relieved way, as though a great floodgate had opened and the relief of pressure needed to be crying. Her tail curled to one side as his continued its circuit to be around hers. The great red turned into a curve-shaped rest for her. Azurea felt the smooth, cool surface of Searanox's body heat pressed up against her cheek. She looked into it, seeing her reflection in one of its facets. She looked rather beat up, and the crusted blood on her temple had dripped into her mane and down her jawline. She gave a loud wail. The great red held her more strongly, trying to think of something, anything comforting and clever to say. Much like dragons did not kiss, dragons did not cry. At least, not that the mortal races knew. It would be a while before she was stable again. Searanox spent the next week or two meekly skulking about his own lair. Everything had fallen into place: power, wealth, and devotion. Azurea had even said it herself. He was now what even the Draconomicon considered to be an ideal mate among red dragons. But now he had a new problem. He did not know how to go about asking her to be his. Azurea had spent a long time in her sanctuary, keeping to herself. He'd been bringing her food and barrels of water, leaving them outside the barrier. He always found them taken when he returned to check on her, but the curtain inside was always closed. Her pet, Auriella, had stopped by, concerned for her mistress, but Searanox had sent her away. He kept vigilant watch for any signs of movement. On perhaps the 10th day of her solitude, she emerged. There was a bit more colour in her cheeks, and her injuries were healing nicely. The blood had been cleaned away, and things on her temple and side was scabbing nicely. "Searanox," she said in a small voice. The great red jolted awake, for he'd been sleeping in the cramped tunnel, waiting for her to come out. He shook doggishly, looking at her blearily. "Have you been out here this whole time?" she whispered.
Nope,
Searanox said with some humour. She snorted air through her nose. Ever the honest dragon he was.
mostly.
He amended gently, watching her pass through the sanctuary barrier and out into the tunnel with him. He wanted to rush and nuzzle her, but waited to see how strong she looked first.
Are you all right?
He asked, cocking his head at her. She gave a small smile. He knew it would be some time before she was completely over everything that had happened, but if she already had the strength to smile, she would recover eventually. She was strong.
Will you be all right?
He tried again. She nodded slowly. He looked around awkwardly, frowning. Searanox folded his wings for comfort, scratching at his undercarriage a little.
Come, if you're up and active, I have something to show you.
Azurea followed him curiously as he took her down some of the winding tunnels to a room she'd never been to before. It was full of rolled-up carpets and old furniture. "A junk room?" she wondered aloud. He pushed most of it aside with the flat of his crown of horns, making a path big enough for both of them. "Oh, wow! Books?" She was honestly surprised that Searanox owned any, and sure enough they looked brand new and untouched. Well, brand new and covered with dust. The spines had never been cracked. He flicked his forked tongue out at her with some annoyance, pulling down the Draconomicon, Red Edition. Azurea made a little O shape with her lips, leaning with grand interest. It was very, very rare for a dragon of any colour to examine a copy of another colour's Draconomicon. It contained the secrets of their culture, their laws, and how everything about them worked. "Pretty," she said in a dreamy way, running the pad of her finger over the ruby-encrusted surface. She flipped it open as he walked around it to sit on his haunches next to her. Azurea scanned the page. which was a detailing on how red dragons breathed fire. She squinted at the tiny writing. It claimed that reds had 2 glands in their mouths that shot separate liquids. When the liquids collided with one another in midair, they would ignite into flame. Unlike a sky dragon's breath, Azurea saw how a red dragon's breath weapon was natural, not magic. Fascinating. Searanox grew a little impatient that she might try to read the whole thing while he sat there. He nosed her, bobbing his head a little. There, at the bookmark. He gestured to a page near the back of the tome that had been dog-eared down. She flipped to it, leaning over. Azurea's eyes scanned the writing. Red dragons attract mates with great feats of power, wealth, and devotion. Not easily swayed into matehood, female reds are known only to mate with the strongest, the wealthiest, or the most powerful red males. While love is a major factor, the aforementioned 3 items must be satisfied first. The male must prove he is worthy of the female, and will be able to support any hatchlings that may result from said mating. Colour touched Azurea's face, and her tail curled a little. So, this is what you've been up to all this time, she mumbled, leaning over it with interest. There were complex illustrations of red dragons chewing on houses, while attractive females looked on. Dragons doing complex mating dances, complete with diagrams on how to do them, and many other ideas. Searanox looked at her carefully while she turned a few more of the pages, blinking with interest. That's what happened with the village, and with the armbands, she said shyly. The great red nodded, lips pursing a few times before he spoke. I want you. The cryptic sentence turned out to be only half a sentence. You to be my my mate. I want you to be my mate, Azurea, my companion, he said, drawing himself up and throwing out his chest in the most virile posture he possibly could. Azurea blanched at him. There was a long silence of the 2 of them staring at one another. She seemed puzzled, and he seemed hopeful. You're serious? She asked carefully, leaning to look at him with narrowed eyes. I don't lie, he reminded her, shrugging some. And this lair would be mine too? She gestured around a little. He nodded. And you'd keep protecting me if someone else came along? He nodded again. And the hoard? She frowned. Half yours, he said easily, which sort of startled her. A dragon did not simply give half his hoard away. To share with a companion was something else entirely. That meant that the both of them could have spent and saved as they pleased, for they'd both own the whole thing together. Should they ever split away, half of it would belong to her. Searanox frowned at her, frustrated at all her questioning. Be mine, Azurea, he growl-whined, nosing her muzzle with his own, steering the head around in odd directions until she started giggling. All right, she said, colour rushing over her face. Searanox's feet thrummed the ground happily. He rushed into close quarters, pressed up against her and nuzzling up and down along her neck. She winced, still sore from her injuries, but certainly loved the attention. My Searanox. She tried it out, to see how it tasted on her tongue. He growl-purred loudly, chewing affectionately on her horns and exploring her mane with his nose. She jittered away, giggling some. It says we have to exchange gifts for it to be official. I've nothing of value to give you. She pointed a hooked claw into the page of the Draconomicon. Using the flat of his tail blades, he flicked the book closed with a snap. They're more like guidelines, really. We'll figure it out as we go.
He was coaxing her out of the room, to the tunnels.
"Will we, eep?"
She squawked loudly when he goosed her rump with his nose. Moving quickly up the tunnel into the hoard room, she peered around as though for the first time. Searanox stood beside her, sitting regally. His wings opened all the way, stretched, then refolded for comfort. He smiled in that warm, lopsided way he sometimes did. She knew that crooked smile was his real smile. The great red's tail ventured slowly forth, over her tail and then under it, intertwining like a pair of young lovers holding hands for the first time. Their tails gingerly turned about one another. Azurea leaned into him, having a great, content sigh. She closed her eyes as he raised her head against his chest. "I really should write to all these aristocrats of yours, and let them know you are officially off the market," Searanox wondered aloud. Azurea snorted, rolling her eyes as her lips curled into a grin. "They keep sending dragons like they're going to pluck you up and deliver you somewhere. I'll have to let them know that the intended recipient is deceased," he growled. She started setting her teeth on his neck here and there, nuzzling the tender spots. Deeper gurgling boiled in his throat. Happy sounds. "What shall we do now, Azurea of the blue sky?" he asked her, tucking her head under his chin. Yellow grass tipped one way, then the other as a gentle breeze kissed it. The massive 7-layered pyramid temple of the architect stood ever vigilant in its own special dimension. The architect herself was dozing upon her throne, the shining golden armor flickering and flaring with its inner golden magic. It was weakening. The breeze then touched her, containing a certain scent. Suddenly, the architect's green eyes snapped open, glaring out at the yellow world of her own creation. Everything was ready now. All the pieces were on the board, standing in their respective places. Turning, she grasped a special wine glass filled with molten gold. She tipped it to the slit in her helmet, choking it down. She clutched at the side of her throne and gagged several times, swallowing it. Panting with effort, she growled and writhed a little in her seat until the feeling passed. Her inner armor flared with an inner light, brighter than the sun itself. Energized, she violently tossed the glass aside where it shattered upon the golden brick ground. Gold moved her hand, she often told to others. Well, in a way. More like,
"Gold keeps me alive."
but they didn't need to know that. Voices whispered to the architect in the back of her mind. So many voices, most of them eager or angry. She did not have the patience to sort out what each one was saying. She shuddered, steeling herself against them.
Searanox the Feared,
she chuckled darkly, wiping the scalding hot metal away from the slit with her gauntlet.
Now that you've built yourself up to the way you were, it's finally time for you to be knocked down again.